The Nile, my mother. I drank this water of life with him. A promise at the meeting, never forgetting this life. This is the promise made by the supreme pharaoh of ancient Egypt to the girl who traveled through time. Many people know their ending isn't perfect. Yet they still can't help but relive their story again and again. And some have fallen in love with Egypt because of their story. Some even swear that in this lifetime, they must visit Egypt at least once. All to personally witness the promise once made between Ivy and Bifitu. A love story that has transcended 1,000 years across the endless desert. The story is based on the novel The Pharaoh's Concubine and adapted into the comic Song of Shark Sea. Today is Ivy, the British girl's 17th birthday. Her friend, Ishian, has prepared a special birthday gift for her. As expected, Ivy, who loves old houses, is absolutely thrilled by the gift in front of her. This is a Book of the Dead, buried with a mummy. And it's remarkably well preserved. Aiden knew his sister had been researching Egypt recently. So he traveled extensively throughout Egypt, spending almost 2 months preparing these gifts. But he didn't know that Ivy wasn't researching Egyptian historical exploration. About ancient Egyptian history, Ivy only knew of Pharaoh Ramesses II. He was the ruler during the last flourishing period of the ancient Egyptian dynasty. He had hundreds of wives and more than 100 children. And in that era of male dominance, a wife statue stood alongside his in the temple. Her name was Nefertari. Rumor had it she was the most beautiful and intelligent woman of her time. Ivy didn't pay much attention when she heard the name. I just thought the name was a bit long. He mischievously asked his older brother, since he had remembered the name, would there be a reward? After all, today is his birthday. One ancient book isn't enough. Ishian signaled for his younger sister to come over. He took out an exquisite snake-shaped gold bracelet, and personally put it on his sister's wrist. It is said that this was a gift from Ramses II to his most beloved woman. Ivy was immediately captivated by the mysterious bracelet, and just as she was completely engrossed, a strange red glow suddenly flickered in the ruby's eyes. Before she could even consider what was happening, her brother's next words robbed her of her ability to think rationally. Ai Xian will be getting married in 3 months. The person she is marrying is Mina, the daughter of an American oil tycoon. After the marriage, in order to expand his business, he will temporarily move to the United States, as the renowned heir to the Marquis of Modi. Ishian not only became the king of the British financial center at a young age due to his exceptional business acumen, but his tall, handsome appearance has also always been popular with girls. Ivy hates being his sister. Yes, she likes her brother. He knew that this feeling was wrong. But he could no longer control his emotions. Tears of sadness uncontrollably flowed from his eyes. One drop of tear just happened to fall onto the serpent-shaped bracelet. The next moment, the serpent's body suddenly shimmered with dazzling golden light. The strange feather once again emerged from his eyes. The bracelet seemed to come alive, opening its serpent mouth. Then, an even stronger light surrounded Ivy's entire body. In terror, Ai Xian kept calling Ai Wei's name, and tried to hug her. But after the light faded, Ai Wei had vanished before her eyes. At the same time, the Book of Death behind Ai Xian began to glow. An ancient script appeared on it. What Ai Xian doesn't know is that the meaning expressed by these words is, abandonment makes you lost in time and space, while the promise brings you back to her side. In 2007, the release of a novel became an eternal pain in many people's hearts. The Pharaoh's favorite wrote a love story that spanned millennia beneath the sky of ancient Egypt. The novel is divided into 3 parts, each more heartbreaking than the last. The comic Shark Sea Song is adapted from the first part of the novel. On Ivy's 17th birthday, a mysterious snake-shaped bracelet sent her to Pharaoh Ramesses. In the vast desert, Ivy was dreaming of cuddling and hugging her brother. Suddenly, she was awakened by some unusual movements. The moment she opened her eyes, a strange red-haired man appeared before her. The other person is still feeling him up, to check if he has any weapons. Ivy screamed in shock at the sight. The other strange masked man immediately apologized to Ivy. It was clearly a strange language she had never heard before, but for some reason, Ivy could understand them. The red-haired man is named Montes. The masked man is named Lidahi. They were curious as to why Ivy, a girl, would appear in the desolate desert. It was then that Ivy realized the place she was in wasn't her hometown of London. Instead, it was another country, Egypt, thousands of miles away. It wasn't until just now that she should have still been celebrating her birthday with her brother, discussing Pharaoh Ramses II and his beloved wife Nefertari. While Ivy was thinking about this, she muttered to herself. Unexpectedly, Lida mistook Nefertari for Ivy's name. He even praised how Egyptian her name was, and how well suited it was to her. Before Ivy could explain, Lida suddenly made a request of her. But Ivy, focused on getting home, didn't want to engage with them. He stood up and looked around, trying to find the direction to the airport. Seeing this, Meng Tusi, in a rush, ignored Li Taha's objections. Without a word, he directly threw Ivy over his shoulder. He immediately noticed Ivy's rare golden hair and blue glasses. He said that Ivy must be their best choice. Lee Taha had no choice but to quickly reassure Ivy, saying that as long as she accompanied them to a banquet tonight, they would send her home tomorrow. He didn't even wait for Ivy's response. Men thus threw Ivy onto his mount. In the blink of an eye, a magnificent city appeared before Ivy. Ivy couldn't believe her eyes. To say this is Egypt is more like saying this is ancient Egypt. Men thus looked at Ivy with a puzzled expression. Haven't you even heard of the Egyptian capital, Thebes? Ivy was completely shocked. Thebes disappeared into the river of history. One of the oldest cities in the world was ancient Egypt, a testament to a highly civilized history. One terrifying fact after another was laid before him, finally making Ivy realize that he had traveled back to a world thousands of years ago. And worse, he might never be able to return to the modern world. Before he could process what had happened, two maids forcibly took Ivy away. The modern girl triggered the power of the mysterious bracelet, accidentally transported to ancient Egypt 3,000 years ago. Ivy had just opened her eyes when she encountered two strange men. They also forcibly took him to the capital of ancient Egypt. Thebes made a name for himself. He invited him to a banquet. Ivy heard about it from you. Both were the pharaoh's most trusted subordinates. One was a young and famous general, commanding a large army and following the pharaoh in his campaigns, north and south. He achieved glorious military feats. The other was a genius prophet of royal blood. At only 19 years old, she's already become a priestess of the great temple. Ivy, even now, still finds it hard to believe. Is this really ancient Egypt? Faced with Ivy's question, the maidservants clearly became impatient. One of them roughly snatched Ivy's headscarf off. The two maidservants were instantly stunned by Ivy's blonde hair and blue eyes. They immediately knelt in apology for their ignorance. At the same time, they promised to make Ivy the most beautiful girl at the banquet. After nightfall, the banquet officially began. This man, embracing a beauty and brimming with confidence, is General Tada. He is always the most spirited person at the banquet. This is the fifth such banquet this year. It is said that the prince specially invited dozens of beautiful girls to serve wine this time. General Tada appeared to be enjoying himself with a grin on his face, but secretly, he mocked the prince as nothing more than a powerless, pleasure-seeking incompetent ruler. Just then, the announcement, "Your Highness has arrived," echoed. The girls present blushed and stared at the door with excitement, because their prince, His Highness, had arrived, more handsome than ever. She had bronze-colored skin and wore a peacock-green outfit. Her sharp features and exquisitely defined face made her stand out. While displaying the aura of a king, she also carries a sense of world-weariness. The night bestowed by the gods is so beautiful. Where are the maidens blessed by the goddess of the harpies now? Under Bifito's urging, the maidens slowly walked into the main hall. The previously chaotic and noisy sounds gradually turned into a unified sigh. There stood Ivy, in a delicate pink gauze dress, with her unique golden hair and blue eyes. The colors most favored by the Egyptians were all gathered in one place. This instantly made her the center of attention. Even Montes couldn't believe it. Is this really the wild girl he picked up from the roadside? The first to react was General Tada. He gasped for breath and lunged at Ivy with open arms. Seeing this, Ivy was so scared she stepped back repeatedly. But she unexpectedly stepped on her sheer skirt, just as he was about to fall. A pair of strong hands steadied him. Ivy's eyes fell upon a broad chest. Prince Bifitu, holding Ivy, said, "I haven't had a beautiful lady's company for long. General Tada, how about you switch?" With that, Bifitu scooped Ivy up in his arms, and walked towards his throne. A British girl unexpectedly travels back to ancient Egypt, 3,000 years ago. Her unique blonde hair and blue eyes make her the center of attention here. She even captures the heart of the pharaoh's son. As the prince raises his cup to celebrate, the banquet officially begins. However, the atmosphere at the scene feels a bit strange to Ivy. Everyone is toasting General Tada, but ignoring the prince. Does she have no status in this palace? And Mentis and Lita are also looking over at Tayton. Ivy remembered the day they met. They had mentioned words like plans. Could they be plotting something? Suddenly, Ivy felt a cold gaze behind her. The moment she turned around, it seemed like it was just her imagination. Bifitu looked at Ivy playfully, and asked for his name. He had a pair of amber eyes more intoxicating than fine wine. In a daze, Ivy said the name Nefertali as a pretense. Bifitu liked the name very much. He was also pleased with Ivy's performance. He gestured for Ivy to sit beside him. It was then that Ivy realized he had been sitting on Bifitu's lap the whole time. His little face turned red. He hurriedly pulled away from Bifitu's body. He sat to the side. Then Bifitu also stood up. It seemed like he was about to say something important. But in the next moment, a wine glass suddenly fell to the floor. At the same time, there was a swish sound. Mentis swiftly struck. Tada then fell onto the table in a daze. immediately following Mentas's shout. Groups of martial artists stormed into the main hall, subduing the ministers. It turned out this was a carefully planned banquet set by Pharaoh specifically for these ministers. These men, taking advantage of their positions, had been harming the people, plundering wealth and resources. Some even colluded with enemy nations to sell weapons. Pharaoh ordered the immediate execution of the main culprit. The other accomplices were exiled and enslaved. Some immediately expressed their dissatisfaction. They were all officials of Pharaoh Qingfeng. Even if they had committed a crime, they should wait for the pharaoh's return to be executed by him. But Pharaoh did not care about this. As the son of an elder king, he had the right to execute those who were disloyal to the pharaoh, or harmful to the nation. With nowhere left to retreat, one of them suddenly broke free from control, and charged at Pharaoh with a drawn knife. Pharaoh immediately drew his sword and countered, easily stabbing the opponent in the chest. He had anticipated that someone would struggle desperately. To this, Pharaoh only showed a satisfied smile, unable to bear seeing someone in pain. Ivy rushed forward and pushed Pharaoh away, but this did not earn any compassion from Pharaoh. She recommended the royal family to punish him even more severely. Calmly, he ordered the beheading of this person's entire clan. Afterward, Pharaoh kept everyone drinking, as if nothing had happened at all. Avery immediately felt a wave of nausea. The person in front of him was so cruel. He also realized how fragile life truly is. He quickly turned and fled from this place. He didn't want to stay for even a second longer. A young girl accidentally travels to ancient Egypt, chosen by the pharaoh's son, forced to become a prince's drinking companion. And on the very same day, he encountered the banquet of doom. As a modern person, Avi had never seen such a tragic situation. He ran away, but he just happened to bump into Rite. He shouted at him, asking if he hadn't promised that as long as he attended this banquet, he would. Should I send him back? But now that he's caught the eye of the pharaoh's son, he no longer has the freedom to leave whenever he wants. Pharaoh hugged Ivy from behind. He asked Ivy where she wanted to go. Wouldn't it be better to stay and drink with him? Ivy's mind was filled with the image of Pharaoh stabbing someone through the chest just moments ago. She felt terrified. She cried out, wanting to go home. I don't want to stay here for another second. I also warned Pharaoh that if he did anything to me, Brother Xian would never let him off. As the son of the pharaoh, no one has ever dared to threaten him like this. Without saying a word, he kissed Ivy's incessantly chattering little mouth. This was Ivy's long-cherished first kiss, looking into Pharaoh's amber-colored eyes. Instead of fear, Ivy now felt more confusion in her heart. Beto asked who Ivy Xian was. Is she his relative? It was then that Ivy remembered her brother was about to get married. After the wedding, he would also move to the US. Even if Ivy went back now, there would be no close relatives left in that large house. He murmured, lowering his head. Maybe it's the same wherever I go. I'll only be alone. Li Fitu patted Ai Wei's head affectionately, asking him why he still wanted to go back. If you haven't figured it out, just stay by my side. He picked up the despondent Ai Wei and said, do you know, when you came to this country, you already became Pharaoh's property, but I won't force you to do anything. Just stay by my side. In the following month, Ivy seemed to become like a canary kept in a cage by Bitutu. He also gradually got used to Bitutu, who, like a curious child, would pull him around asking all sorts of questions. Here, everything, food, clothing, shelter, and transportation, was served to him. Ivy feels like she has the whole world, yet it seems like she has nothing. And Biafatu never truly understands what Ivy is thinking. No matter how kind he is to her, he still acts as if he's keeping everyone at arm's length. It's as if they're not in the same world. A modern girl travels back 3,000 years to ancient Egypt. And because of her extraordinary beauty, she catches the eye of an Egyptian prince. Ivy hates being treated like a caged canary. So, she went to find Lidahi again. Ivy confronted him, demanding to know when he would fulfill his promise. Lidahi had promised her that he would take her home after the party. But now, a month had already passed. Lidahi pretended to just remember it. Then, with a mischievous grin, he asked Ivy if staying here wasn't so bad. He rambled on and said a lot of good things about Bifito. No matter how much Lita said, Ivy still couldn't understand what was so great about that cruel prince. Then Lita deliberately changed the topic. He said he had work to do now. The farmers were rioting because of a poor harvest. However, Lita realized that he had said something Ivy couldn't understand. He apologized to Ivy for his slip of the tongue. To Ivy, it seemed as if they were mocking him. In modern times, this was an area of study he had specifically researched. Ivy instinctively pointed out the issue. Peasant uprisings occur because people can't get enough to eat. Spending money to fix infrastructure will solve it. As long as some tasks, originally assigned to hired craftsmen and slaves, are given to farmers, virtuous farmers won't rebel due to hunger. Slaves don't die from overwork. Ivy didn't realize how shocked her words had made Rita. While he was still rambling on about taxes, Rita was seen bowing slightly to someone behind him. Ivy immediately realized it was Bifatu. Several others who had just finished a meeting with him were behind him. Ministers. It looked like they had also heard Ivy's words. One of the ministers quickly approached Ivy. At the same time, he stared at him with a sharp gaze. Where did you hear the young lady's words from just now? Ivy quickly explained. In their country. There are many people who understand this. He even took the opportunity to lie, saying that if they let him go back, he could introduce more intellectuals in this field. But the minister didn't seem to believe it much. Ivy's excessively beautiful appearance had already left them puzzled. And on top of that, the surrounding area is made up of small, uncivilized nations. At this moment, Bifatu stepped in front of Ivy. Hyman, this is my person. You don't need to ask any more questions. The minister realized he had been impolite. He quickly bowed and left. Bifatu then spoke to Ivy. What he just said is Egypt's national policy. His father ruled for many years. The policies toward farmers have ranged from suppression in the beginning to subsidies later on. Each approach has had its pros and cons. They've never really solved the farmers' problems well. Bifatu slowly moved closer to Iway. His colleague continued. They spent years experimenting before coming up with the latest implementation plan. But Ivy easily revealed the full picture. This only deepened Bifatu's infatuation with Ivy. Now, it was even less possible for him to let Ivy go. A modern girl travels through time to ancient Egypt. With her modern knowledge, she casually speaks of the national policies that they had spent years researching. Her already outstanding appearance, combined with this brilliant intellect, made the Egyptian prince more and more captivated by her. Bifatu decided to marry Ivy at the Nile River Festival. For his first strategy fee. This is the identity that countless girls dream of. But Ivy doesn't want to be any princess at all. He shouts that he just wants to go home. Back to the home with the idol brother. In a fit of jealousy, Bifatu punches Ivy into the pillar behind him. He can't help but want to meet that man named Sien. Bifatu forcefully pulled Ivy into his arms. He emphasized to Ivy that this was Egypt, and he was the son of the Pharaoh. Everything here, including Ivy, belonged to him. He told Ivy to wait patiently for the day she would become the queen. Then he turned and left. Several days later, it passed in the blink of an eye. Ditahek told Iway that tomorrow would be the day of the Nile River's high tide, to thank the goddess of the Nile for her blessings. A grand celebration would be held here. Just as Ditahek was marveling at how great Egypt was, Iway interrupted him. She asked who the current pharaoh of Egypt was. This made Litahi wonder from the bottom of his heart. Where on earth did this little girl come from? She didn't even know who Seti I was. As for the name Seti I, Iway only had a vague impression. What Jack Ritar said, that they would use the Nile's water resources for the construction project. He tried to recall what period of Egyptian history this was, but he would soon regret not learning history properly back then. Although Rite had no idea what Iway was troubled about, he had to remind Iway that there was something more important to focus on right now. That was that tomorrow, His Highness would announce Iway as his first strategist. Iway told Rite that she had actually been nervous about this matter at first, but later, she had thought it through. Since ancient times, marriage has been the best way for royal families to consolidate power. The pharaoh would never agree to an unknown foreigner becoming the queen. Baitar did not expect that Ivy would be so self-aware. This matter, whether the pharaoh agrees or not. Even Yuan Laohui and the others below have already gone mad. Hyman reminded Bifatu not to. You can focus on your own personal affairs with your children, but you also need to think about the country. Right now, war is raging on all sides of Egypt. The priority is to quickly marry a powerful princess from a neighboring country. Of course, Bifatu understands all of this, but he always feels that if he doesn't marry Ivy soon, she might disappear from his side at any moment. So, no matter what, Bifatu insists on marrying Ivy as his consort. But he also chose to listen to some opinions from others. He would reconsider the time and manner of marrying Ivy. The young girl accidentally traveled back to ancient Egypt because of a snake-shaped bracelet. The pharaoh's son fell in love with her at first sight. He insisted on marrying her no matter what. This made Ivy very troubled. She tried several times to escape from the palace, but she was caught by the soldiers before even making it out of the corridor. He really didn't want to be involved in the pharaoh's schemes. They shouldn't have any connection at all. The other side was a symbol carved on the pyramids 3,000 years later, and he was just a modern person who had stumbled in. Ivy looked at the Nile River, its tide constantly rising below. She thought that jumping in might let her escape. Just then, a large hand reached from behind Ivy and embraced her. Bifei too nervously said that Ai Wei was his person. She needed to be responsible for both him and herself in everything she did. Ai Wei's face turned red. She immediately denied it. She wasn't his person. Li Fita stopped arguing with Ai Wei. He told Ai Wei that he had personally gone to the market. The situation was exactly as Ai Wei had expected. Many farmers are willing to work at the vegetable market during their off-season. This not only solves the problem for farmers, but the completion of the pyramid can also be expedited. Speaking of the pyramid, Ivy actually wants to observe the construction of the pyramid in person. Is it really built as the legend says, with ramps of earth to move the stones? Biffet looked at Ivy, who was spacing out again. He quickly picked Ivy up. He really wants to know what Ivy is thinking. He also wants to understand what kind of person Ivy truly is, why she is so different from everyone else. And when he mentions the man named Sien, the loneliness and sadness that show in her eyes, it makes Biffet both jealous and reluctant to see her sad. Unknowingly, he has already longed to become the person in Ivy's heart. Biffet took out a glowing golden object and presented it to Ivy. It was the snake-shaped golden bracelet that had brought Ivy to ancient Egypt. This was a one-of-a-kind bracelet specially customized for Ivy by Biffet. The Egyptian snake is a symbol of supremacy. As long as she wears it, it will prove that Ivy belongs to him. However, despite Biffet's passionate words, Ivy didn't listen to a single one. He was full of thoughts. Since it was this bracelet that sent him to ancient times, perhaps if he put it on again, he might truly return home. Back to the home with Brother Sien. Under the majestic and grand Sphinx, the people of ancient Egypt were celebrating the annual Nile festival. The shouting was as deafening as an earthquake. Ivy had her first direct experience of the walls of ancient Egypt. At the same time, she realized how deeply beloved Biffet was by the people. On this auspicious day, Pharaoh said, "I arranged a marriage for Biffet." Ivy knew deep down that this was the best and most natural outcome. Biffet would become the supreme pharaoh, and then marry the noble princess. All he had to do was wear this bracelet, so he could return to his brother's side, and end all this absurd nonsense. But his mind kept returning to the promise Biffet had once made him. Ivy put away the bracelet in her hand, and ran towards the ballroom. At this moment, he was still unaware of his own feelings. He was simply very concerned about what kind of wife Biffet would marry. The somewhat plump woman before him, the one stumbling while walking, is Princess Lornita of Libya. Biffet frowned slightly. The pharaoh, however, seemed to ignore the awkwardness of the Libyan princess. He casually assigned him to his eldest son, as his second wife. The wedding is set for tomorrow. Avi, who was among the onlookers, quietly watched him, just wanting to see what Biffet's wife would look like as soon as possible. At this moment, another girl walked in. She is Hymen's youngest daughter, Camerota. Murmurs arose from the crowd, commenting that Hymen was aging fast. Yet, he still had such a beautiful young daughter, just as everyone thought she would become Biffet's wife. The pharaoh assigned her to the fourth prince. Ivy was also a bit surprised. So, she wasn't marrying Biffet after all. But what surprised him the most was that Hymen's eldest daughter was actually the pharaoh's wife. What kind of incestuous relationship is this? But Ivy thought for a moment that when Biffet becomes king in the future, to consolidate his position, similar marriages would probably happen one after another. Ivy knew that this was quite normal in ancient royal power, but his eyes still showed a lonely look. Lefita's gentle and focused gaze will one day be shown to someone else, I suppose. And just when everyone thought the banquet was over, the pharaoh summoned one last girl inside. He also said he would surely satisfy Bifitu. Then, in a quiet wait, a reluctant girl was brought into the hall. She was a noble purple-clad young girl from head to toe. Ivy couldn't help but exclaim, "What a beautiful person." She is Princess Mat, the 17th princess of the Hittite kingdom, also known as Princess Nijiru. But the first thing she said to Pharaoh was, "Kill me." She was a noble purple-clad young girl from head to toe. She was also the bride chosen for Bifitu by Pharaoh. Her stunning beauty left everyone in awe. She was the 17th and most cherished princess of the Hittite king, Princess Mat Nefertari. But because of her willful and rebellious nature, she fled the marriage her father had arranged for her. During her escape, she became involved with warriors, and was captured by Pharaoh Seti I. Mat Nefertari, who had fallen into the hands of the enemy, refused to surrender easily. She pointed at Pharaoh and cursed him loudly. She looked like she would rather die than submit. Ivy couldn't help but feel anxious for her. Does this princess even realize her current situation? Lefita thought to himself. This might be for the best. Father will likely kill her or exile her. Either way, then she wouldn't have been forced to become his concubine. But the pharaoh wasn't angry. Instead, he burst into laughter. He not only didn't intend to harm the princess, but also insisted on making him a test for the concubine. But they would never give him a formal wedding ceremony. The princess, touted as the most beautiful and the king's most beloved since the founding of the Hittite kingdom, would only become a nameless concubine to test the Egyptian prince. The pharaoh's goal was to bring this immense shame upon the Hatti kingdom. Then the pharaoh stood up. He raised his arm and shouted. Their thousands of troops would crush the Hatti throne. The Hatti kingdom would sooner or later become Egyptian territory. The envoys of other nations, who had always remained neutral, began to waver. Those who had originally planned to show goodwill to Hatti, now turned to support Egypt. Fateh sat down on the ground, completely stunned. Now, it's even worse than killing him. He has completely lost the face of Hatti kingdom. He can never go back. The pharaoh urged Bifitu to hurry and take him away. The ministers nearby were all smiling and congratulating his highness. Only Bifitu stood there, stunned. No one knows what he's hesitating about. Even Ivy understands. Not only can this kill the enemy's morale now, but if the princess has their children in the future, it will bring even greater humiliation to the Crane Kingdom. Ivy comforted herself in her heart, thinking that she had gained a lot from this trip to ancient Egypt. She would tell Brother Xian when she got back. He would definitely be amazed and excited. Mingming had the key to her home right in her hand. But Ai Wei felt inexplicably uneasy. Faced with the marriage arranged by the pharaoh, Bifitu ultimately agreed. She reached out her hand to the Hittite princess. Ai Wei understood this was the right course of action. For ancient monarchs, marriage was merely a tool to consolidate power. Although he didn't know why, there was an indescribable feeling in his heart. But as long as he wore this bracelet, everything here would no longer have any connection to him. However, after a while, the snake-shaped bracelet on his hand still hadn't changed in any way. A terrifying thought flashed through Ivy's mind. Could it be that she could never go back? And just then, Bifitu spotted Ivy blending in with the crowd. Ivy immediately turned and ran out of the hall. Almost simultaneously, Bifitu quickly chased after her, amidst the crowd's exclamations. Ivy hadn't run far before he caught up with her. Bifitu looked at Ivy's disguise with some frustration. He thought Ivy was trying to escape. When Bifitu found out Ivy was just secretly watching the commotion, he tentatively asked Ivy if she had seen it. Ivy simply and honestly said she had. She even praised the Hittite princess's beauty. But this wasn't the answer Bifitu wanted. He hoped Ivy would show more complex emotions. For example, not wanting him to marry the Hittite princess. But Ivy's answer remained very rational. He considered Bifitu marrying the Hittite princess a good thing. Bifitu suddenly grabbed Iwei's jaw and asked him, "Don't you care about yourself at all?" Iwei's bewildered eyes held a hint of terror. He knew he couldn't meet Bifitu's expectations. He said there shouldn't be any connection between them. Bifitu was completely furious. He didn't understand why this somewhat peculiar girl always wanted to leave, to a place that seemed to always be out of his reach. Thinking about this, Bifitu's eyes were filled with despair. He immediately swore to Ivy that he would sever any relationship with Princess Hetty right away. He could marry Ivy right now, and promised to give her everything she wanted. Faced with Bifitu's heartfelt confession, Ivy was indeed a little moved in her heart, but she understood that she could never be Bifitu's only wife. On his long and arduous journey for power, there will be second, third, or even more Princess Hettys. Ivy suddenly felt a sense of sadness. Why should she care about these things? Isn't what matters most why she ended up lost in this time and space? And why did she meet him? Would she ever have a chance to return to the modern world? And just then, the snake-shaped bracelet began to emit a strange light. Ivy stared intently at the familiar light. The next moment, the light began to envelop his entire body. Bifitu frantically called out Ivy's alias, Nefertari. He instinctively realized that the bracelet would take Ivy away, but he could only watch helplessly as Ivy disappeared into the light. When Ivy opened his eyes again, he saw the familiar face of his Xian Gij. The serpent-shaped bracelet in Ivy's hand emitted a strange glow once again. Bifitu could only watch helplessly as Ivy disappeared before her eyes. In her confusion, Ivy recalled the moments from her childhood when she was always with her mother. Her mother in her memories was an elegant and graceful woman, with some Eastern heritage. She was always composed and dignified. Her mother had always taught her to face everything with a smile. She thought such a beautiful mother would always be there to watch her grow. Until that winter when Ivy was 15 years old, her mother suddenly left her. And just when it seemed like Ivy was all alone in her world, Godian found her, and told her about Ivy's origins. She is the little princess of the Mordiath family. Her brother took her back to that family. He also promised that he would never leave Ivy alone again. Ivy slowly opened her eyes in her memories. What came into view were her father and brother standing beside her. Realizing that she had returned to the modern world, Ivy excitedly sat up. She looked at her brother in front of her, surprised. Not only was he dressed in rags, but he was also smiling. It was the first time she had seen her brother like this. And her father's next words made Ivy's disbelief even greater. It turned out that during the months Ivy spent in ancient Egypt, he had only disappeared for a week in the modern world. It wasn't until last night, when he collapsed on the lawn at home, that Ayan found him. Awei looked down at her wrist. She found that the bracelet was still there. The time-space distortion must be related to this bracelet. She took off the bracelet and secretly hid it in the blanket. When her father asked about what happened during this time, Awei just lied and said she couldn't remember anything from that period. After all, having traveled back to ancient Egypt 3,000 years ago, this kind of thing, if I were to say it, would probably just make me look like a fool. Seeing Ivy lost in thought, her father figured she must have suffered quite a bit. He lovingly hugged his daughter and comforted her. Meanwhile, Ai Xian just silently sat by, until her father left the room. The atmosphere was inexplicably awkward. Ivy always feels that her brother is in a bad mood. Because Aeson didn't believe Ivy's words earlier, he hoped that Ivy would tell him the truth about what happened during this time. He was different from their easily deceived father. Aeson had seen Ivy disappear into a strange light with his own eyes. So no matter how absurd Ivy's story sounded, he would choose to believe her. But Ivy kept insisting that she had forgotten. She doesn't plan to tell anyone, because she plans to forget that experience herself. Seeing Ivy still tight-lipped, Aishian had no choice but to ask in another way, who is Bai-Fi 2? This man wakes up every day thinking he's handsome. He could easily make a living with his looks, but he insists on relying on his talent. In just a few short years, Aishian had become the king of the UK's financial centre through his superb operational skills. In his world, marriage was merely a stepping stone to success. Women were merely dispensable to him. But there was one exception. Aishian looked at Ai Wei with a serious expression, and asked him who this Bifitu person was. Ivy didn't expect that she had called Bifitu's name while unconscious. Ivy sensed from her sister's unconcealed expression that things weren't that simple. Bifitu sounds like an Arab man's name. Could Ivy have been with that man during her disappearance? The thought of what might have happened between them made Aishian increasingly unable to control her emotions. Ivy also noticed her brother's changing expression. She asked her brother, in confusion, why he cared about all this. Ivy immediately explained that there's no need for a reason to care about her sister. She also said that the mysterious person approaching Ivy must have an agenda. Hearing her brother's obvious response, Ivy couldn't help but show a look of desolation in her eyes. She knew she shouldn't have any expectations. After all, her brother was already preparing to get married. Ivy explained again that her marriage had nothing to do with him caring about her, but this only made Ivy more agitated. Since her brother is getting married and leaving her, why should he still control her? Shouldn't she be allowed to fall in love and be with someone else? Aishian listened to his sister's words with a blank expression, unable to think of a way to explain. When he wanted to say something else to his sister, Ivy has buried her head in the blankets, and no longer responds. Her sister's resistant reaction made Aishian's heart ache. Helpless, Aishian left the room after saying, "Get some rest." She leaned against the door outside, quietly lost in thought. Once, she had fought alone in a harsh environment, all on her own. The higher she climbed, the fewer people stayed by her side. Under the spotlight, everything around her was pitch black. And at that moment, she met her biological sister for the first time. She was as beautiful as an angel, illuminating Aijian's life. Yet she was so fragile. It made Aishian unable to stop herself from protecting her. During the days they lived together, they got along harmoniously. It was as if they were born to understand each other. They were bound by blood, becoming the closest relationship in the world. This should have been something to be happy about, but at the same time, it was precisely because of the words, bound by blood. It made Ai feel so desperate. Ever since Ivy returned to the modern world, she often zones out. She keeps thinking about Bifitu. The one who once struck fear across the land would have surely built a prosperous dynasty. But Ivy searched through history books, and couldn't find her name anywhere. Could it be that Bifitu never became a pharaoh? Or just an unrecorded, mediocre pharaoh? And Ivy didn't want to dwell on those memories anymore. Returning to her normal life, Ivy attended a college admissions interview today. Ivy was presenting her research on the ancient Egyptian economy. She stated her well-understood views clearly and concisely. Facing the professor's questions, she answered with ease. The professors didn't expect such a young girl to have such profound knowledge of economic history. They couldn't help but confirm Ivy's age again. Then, they began a heated discussion about Ivy's defense just now. As long as she passes today's interview, Ivy will receive an offer from Cambridge University. Then, she can temporarily escape the oppressive family atmosphere. In the months after her return, her father had caused the entire family to live in fear, as he searched for the kidnappers behind Ivy's disappearance. But Ivy still didn't have the courage to tell her father the truth. Now, she could only hope for a fresh start on campus. At this point, one of the professors added another question. He asked Ivy what she thought of the glory of Ramses II. Ivy was momentarily stunned, although the professor said it was just a broad question, and that Ivy could just speak freely. Ivy, who wasn't good at history, didn't dare to say anything offhand. She had no choice but to mention the well-known historical facts that the general public was familiar with. And when she mentioned that Ramses II had over 200 wives during his 90-plus years of life, a professor interrupted Ivy's response. He said they held Ivy's paper in high regard, but expressed doubts about the accuracy of her historical research. Then the professor revealed something that shocked Ivy. He said that Ramses II, after inheriting the throne from Seti I, died less than 2 years later. He only had 3 wives in his entire life. The Princess Metet of Luti and her sister, the priestess. There was also the foreign Princess Nefertari, who passed away young, and she left behind no heirs. On the rainy streets, Avi, disregarding the gaze of others, ran straight toward the library. He couldn't believe what the professor had just said, and at the same time, he had a bad feeling. He began researching the history of Ramses II. Historical records corresponded exactly with Ivy's unforgettable memories. The historical text's brief assessment of Ramses II's life stated that had he not died young, his achievements would have far surpassed those of his namesake grandfather, Ramses I. And in his short life, he built many temples. Wherever his statues were found, there would also be the image of his most beloved wife, Nefertari. The murals revealed Ramses II's endless longing for her. But historical records offered no further information. The account was as fleeting as an ephemeral bloom. One terrifying fact after another confronted Ivy. Finally, he realized that Befit was Ramses II. But because of his reckless intrusion, he had drastically altered history. He dared not imagine what would happen after he left. What exactly happened to Befitu? Ivy only discovered the astonishing truth today. Befitu was actually the famous Ramesses II. And Befitu, who should have lived to be 90, died shortly after he left. Even if he doesn't want to admit it, the only possible explanation for this is that his absurd journey into ancient Egypt altered history. Ivy walked down the rain-soaked street with his head down. His eyes were filled with self-reproach and confusion. A deep black sedan arrived. It stopped beside Ivy. He didn't notice it until the coat was draped over his head. His older brother, asked him gently what he was doing here. Seeing his brother's gentle gaze, Ivy's previously feigned strength finally broke down. He choked up and said he had made an unforgivable mistake. I don't know what to do right now. Aicien hugged her tightly and comforted her. No matter what she did wrong, I'll be there with her, sharing the burden. And I won't let anyone bully her. Aicien felt a familiar feeling, a sense of déjà vu. She felt like she had promised Ai Wei long ago that she would always protect her. But Ai Wei still looked very confused, because it was simply too unbelievable. He tried to confide in his older brother, but, always so logical, he blurted out a bunch of illogical nonsense. If he went back thousands of years, met strangers in a strange land, could his brother still appear to protect him? Only after saying this did Ai Wei realize he had irresponsibly dumped all his anxieties on his brother. Aicien didn't blame him. He simply hugged Ivy again. He said firmly in his sister's ear, no matter where he went, he would always appear to protect her, just like now. In her brother's arms, Ivy felt the close bond of their blood relationship. At the beauty salon the next day, the girl with bronze skin and short hair was actually Ivy herself. He went through a series of back-and-forth adjustments by the staff, and got a complete makeover. He also ordered 3 months' worth of portable spray bottles in one go. After leaving the salon, he began checking his supplies. Flashlight, pepper spray, binoculars. At the same time, he also brought Bayu, and all the preparations Ivy made. It was to return once again to ancient Egypt, 3,000 years ago, to make that brutal prince lose 70 years of his life for nothing. It really made it impossible for him to live a peaceful, normal life. This time, returning, he wants to make Befitu and the real Nefertari marry each other. As an observer, he will push history back into place. Modern girl Ivy finally managed to return to her original world from ancient Egypt, but she discovered that due to her accidental misstep, it changed the history of Pharaoh Ramses II. With the intention of making up for past mistakes, Ivy transformed herself. She prepared to return to ancient Egypt once again. This time, she decided to intervene as an observer, pushing history back into place. Just as she landed, Ivy encountered a red-haired man, just like last time. He immediately asked if Ramses II was dead. The red-haired man, upon hearing this, disdainfully shoved Ivy aside. Where did this country bumpkin come from? How dare they speak such disrespectful words to the newly appointed pharaoh, who has only been in power for 3 days? Learning that they were still alive, better than a bandit, Ivy's heart immediately settled. The red-haired man is called Buka, and he is the son of the village chief from a nearby village. He looked at Ivy as if she were a foreigner. Curiously, he asked why she was here. This time, Ivy didn't use a fake name. She even honestly revealed her address in England. Anyway, none of that was important. What mattered was that he had to rush to Dibus to find Befitu, second by second. But this was Giza, in the region where Egypt and Libya border. It was quite far from Dibus. But Ivy is lucky. At just the right time, Befitu happened to be in the nearby Memphis Palace. It was about 10 days' journey from here. Coincidentally, Buka was also going to Memphis to find her brother. So she decided to do a good deed, and take Ivy along with her. Speaking of the Giza region, the current lord of Giza is Befitu's older brother. As the eldest prince of Egypt, he should have been the first in line to inherit the throne. But ultimately, Seti I gave the position of the eldest son to the second in line, by Nepta. And the first prince was assigned here to be a lord. While they were chatting on the road, Ivy heard that familiar name again, Nefertari. Rumor has it he died 5 years ago, but the current pharaoh still remembered him fondly. Apart from political considerations, The pharaoh only had 2 wives, yet he neither favored them, nor did he take any new wives. Just then, Buka's eagle suddenly grew alert, and flew off into the distance. Following the eagle's lead, they saw a man lying in a pool of blood. The man had multiple knife wounds, and an arrow sticking out of his back. They initially thought it was bandits, but things weren't that simple. With his last ounce of strength, the man told them that neighboring Libya had unilaterally torn up the contract. They attacked their Muklai village. Ivy returned to ancient Egypt 3,000 years ago to save Bifitu. But she encountered major trouble on the way. Kimberly Libya tore up the contract without authorization, and attacked a small village on the Egyptian border. Buka was extremely angry because of this. He had originally planned to go to Giza to seek the help of the crown prince, but Ivy sensed something was wrong. She immediately stopped Buka. Giza is only a day's journey from the attacked village. The crown prince couldn't have not received the news yet. Yet 3 days have passed, and still no troops have been sent. There are only 2 possibilities for this. 1. Giza has also been occupied by the enemy. The second possibility is that the prince and the Libyans are in cahoots. No matter which possibility it is, they cannot go to the sacrifice now. However, Ivy reassured Buka not to panic. They still have a way. Ivy told Buka to use his eagle to find his brother in Memphis. He specifically reminded him, "We can only send soldiers for help. We must not let the pharaoh go himself. He fears the Libyans are not just harassing the border." Ivy tossed a pen and paper from her backpack to Buka. Buka didn't have time to examine the strange items in his hand, and was urged by Ivy to quickly write the letter. They needed to hurry back to the village right away. Any crisis now could threaten Bifitu's life. So Ivy reminded herself, to save Bifitu, she absolutely couldn't be careless. On the other side, in the Memphis Palace, located in the lower reaches of the Nile River, it was the most important city in Lower Egypt, a place that all pharaohs had to visit, even stay. The newly crowned Bifitu was no exception. At this moment, Buka's eagle arrived here, and landed on a man's hand. He was none other than our old acquaintance, Montes, who is also Buka's older brother. After reading the note that Buka had sent him, his expression changed dramatically. Montes immediately ordered his servant to bring him his cloak. The scene shifts. We arrived at the pharaoh's bedchamber. Menta was extremely anxious, but he could only wait anxiously outside the room, for inside, a passionate encounter was taking place. The woman blushed, pleading to serve her king again. But Bifitu coldly told her to take her reward and leave immediately. He warned her not to be so presumptuous again. Kill without mercy. The girl experienced it firsthand. Just as the rumor said, the new pharaoh possesses a stunning appearance that excites all the girls in Egypt. Although he has a reputation for womanizing, girls all over the land still hope to receive his favor. However, of the girls who received his favor, not a single one was made a queen. Some even have illusions about this. They will mysteriously die. After a violent storm of turmoil, Bifitu threw the girl he had just pleased aside and got up to leave. As soon as he stepped outside, he saw Montes, who had been waiting anxiously. When he heard Montes say he had important military matters to report, Bifitu immediately guessed it was the Libyans harassing their border. At the same time, he also guessed that Giza had not sent troops to rescue them. He showed no sign of tension. Instead, he smiled slightly, because he knew that his brother, the king, would eventually turn against him. Mentis didn't expect it. It turned out that Bitu had already anticipated everything. Moreover, his well-built figure and handsome face made Mentis, also a man, lose his composure. Bitu was a bit puzzled. Why would even Mentis know about this? Could the enemy forces already be approaching here? Menta told Bifit that wasn't the case. Instead, his brother sent word via Eagle that the Giza region has likely already rebelled. Their alliance with Libya this time isn't a simple border skirmish. Buka requests reinforcements be sent as soon as possible. However, the letter also particularly emphasizes that the pharaoh must absolutely not personally lead the army. The tone of the letter caused Bifit to become suspicious. Did Mentha's younger brother really write this? Bifit took the strange note. It actually said, "Remember, Pharaoh must not leave prematurely due to greed for merit." Memphis is quite bold. A dangerous gleam shone in Bifit's eyes, yet it seemed tinged with excitement. Mentha thought his king was angry, so he immediately pleaded for his younger brother. At the same time, he volunteered to handle the campaign. Bifitu jokingly said that his brother, so brave and resourceful, shouldn't find it difficult to delay the enemy for a few days. Just when Montes was confused by this, Bifitu suddenly turned serious and said that he would personally lead a small group to rescue them, while asking Montes to stay behind here, because he suspected that unrest would soon break out in Memphis, or even that the army of a hostile nation might invade. For this reason, he would leave his strongest forces to Memphis. At this point, Memphis finally understood that the attack on the village was just a decoy. But by doing this, Bifitu would also be in considerable danger. Didn't he fear that Memphis might take this opportunity to rebel? However, when Bifatu turned and left, he only instructed Mengtis to keep the incident secret. Don't let anyone know. Mengtis hadn't expected that the king would trust him so much, yet he himself had been suspicious of him. He immediately knelt on one knee. He pledged to Bifatu he would definitely protect Memphis and await the king's triumphant return. Ivy urged in her letter that the pharaoh must not be allowed to go to war, but after seeing the note, Bifatu, whether out of curiosity or excitement, insisted on personally leading the troops to the rescue. Meanwhile, Ivy was rushing to the affected village with Buka. He drank water greedily, simultaneously listening to Buka's account of the situation. Giza is located in the Mediterranean region. It borders several countries. Travelers and merchants have brought a rich variety of goods to the people here. In contrast, the people along the Libyan border live in poverty and hunger. As a result, Libya has always eyed the wealthy Giza region with envy. Although a peace treaty has been signed, Egypt is currently in a time of transition between old and new dynasties, the most unstable moment. As long as we succeed, the so-called treaty will be nothing but a scrap of paper. If King Shing sends a large army to rescue him at this time, to consolidate his power, Memphis will just be a fallen city. Speaking of which, even Buka understands that the pharaoh is in great danger right now, but the two ordinary people can't do much. Ivy could only pray that after Bifatu saw the note, he wouldn't bring troops here. Soon after, they arrived at the attacked village. Buka immediately rushed forward. He helped the village chief, who was dying on the ground, up. The village chief knew he was beyond saving. He handed the token to Buka and asked him to lead the surviving villagers to escape. It was as if he had completed the last thing in his life. The village chief's hands fell limply to the ground. Ivy had expected the war to be brutal, but when he witnessed firsthand the devastation left by the war, his heart could not bear the sight. He wondered, was this God's punishment for disrupting history? Ivy clenched his fists. Now was not the time for grief. He urged Buka to pull himself together quickly and lead the villagers out of here. At this moment, Buka seemed to understand the words his brother had once said. The pharaoh can convince others with simple words, making them willingly risk their lives for him. If Iway were his master, he would also give his all for him. Those blue eyes, filled with wisdom, seemed to bring endless hope. At this moment, in the Libyan military camp, General Fatty was chomping down on a chicken leg with big bites. He was already fantasizing about how, upon his victorious return, His Majesty would surely marry Princess Dishi to him. The position of Libya's top general was already within reach. But at that moment, he received a report from his subordinate. It said that the villagers in the nearby village were retreating in an orderly manner. General Fatty couldn't help but feel a bit puzzled. Has Pharaoh's army arrived so soon? But after all, his goal isn't these villagers. Just as he was about to retreat and continue waiting, his subordinates hurriedly brought him a report. It turns out Pharaoh hadn't sent a single soldier to rescue these villagers. Pharaoh's entire army remained stationed in Memphis. Realizing he had been tricked by those villagers, General Fatty was furious. He decided to turn that group of villagers into minced meat. Bitu was finally going to meet Ivy. Would he recognize Ivy right away? Not long ago, Ivy and Buka gathered the surviving villagers together. Unlike Ivy, who was focused on drinking water like a big bucket, Buka seemed a little impatient, because he was really worried if Ivy's plan would really work. Leaving openly without confirming that the Pharaoh's army would come to our rescue, and keeping it a secret from the villagers, Ivy wiped the corner of her mouth, and calmly said, if you want to deceive others, you must first deceive yourself. Now is the time when the Libyan army is least likely to be suspicious about a retreat. That being said, Ivy was still a little worried, because the premise of this plan is that reinforcements will come to rescue them. According to the estimated time, the reinforcements should be arriving soon. If Beto didn't send troops, then all of this would be for nothing. Buka looked at Ivy, deep in thought. She couldn't help but feel a strong desire to protect this boy in front of her, who looked like a fragile girl. If Ivy were a girl, he would probably be willing to protect her for a lifetime. In this moment of crisis, Buka couldn't help but express his desire to protect Ivy. Ivy smiled and thanked Buka. Once everything is over, and I return to the year 3000, I will definitely remember Buka, this friend of mine. At that moment, the Libyan army attacked. This proves they've received word that Memphis isn't sending reinforcements. Did Befit truly abandon them? Iway tried to calm the panicked crowd, but in the face of terror, no one wanted to stop. Even Buka grabbed his hand, urging him to run. But how can a person's two legs outrun a warhorse? Ivy couldn't help but wonder. Had she made another mistake? Not only had she failed to correct history, but she had also cost more lives. At that moment, a sudden cheer of joy rang out beside her. The Pharaoh's army is here to save us. King Ramesses too. Ivy suddenly turned her head to look. Among a group of soldiers on high alert, a person was sitting proudly on a warhorse. Could it really be Bitu? Ivy began to recall what Bidu looked like in her memories. The youthful arrogance and the restlessness that was always hard to conceal. But who is this person in front of her, so familiar yet so unfamiliar? Every gesture exuded the fierce, domineering aura of a king. Is this Befit truly how he is? With a sweep of Befit's hand, a resounding war cry of the Pharaoh's army erupted. Clear troop deployment, perfectly formed ranks, and brave warriors fighting. In just a moment, the Libyan army fell, their bodies strewn across the ground. Avi stared at everything in front of her. Is this the true power of ancient Egypt at its peak? 5 years later, Befitu finally met Avi again. But Avi was no longer the fair-skinned, beautiful blonde girl she once was. Now, she was just a tomboy with short black hair. Just before entering, Avi had even sprayed her face to make it look darker. Now, it's likely that even his brother and father wouldn't recognize him. The only thing that remains the same as before is his big blue eyes. It's normal for Befitu to not recognize himself. And to Ivy, the Befitu in front of her also feels just as unfamiliar. It's clearly the same eyes, the same nose and mouth. The prince who once burned with the passionate heat of a desert sun. Now, his whole body is completely covered in ice. It's freezing. Befitu smiled faintly and returned to his seat. At this moment, Ivy learned from their conversation that Buka was actually Mengta's younger brother. When he heard that Ivy was the one who organized the retreat and wrote him the letter, Befitu asked him why he had written such a note. Ivy honestly explained his reasoning. The attack in Libya this time is just a diversion. The real goal is to move the main forces away from Memphis. Befitu asked Ivy with interest what they should do next. Ivy recalled the history she had altered. If not for the short life of Ramesses II, her achievements would have far surpassed those of her grandfather, Ramesses I. She would have become a legendary emperor, remembered throughout history. Now, there's no time for him to hesitate. You must do everything you can to earn Befitu's trust. Ivy shared his thoughts on the incident and the approach moving forward. Although it sounded great, it seemed that this was not the answer Befitu was looking for. Then Befitu began to tell a story from his past. As a child, he had raised a young lion in the palace. Not only did he feed the lion fresh antelope every day, but he also crafted the most expensive accessories for it using gold and jewels. In 3 years, the money spent on the lion was enough to ensure that several villages could live comfortably for a lifetime. But during a ritual, the lion suddenly went wild. It attacked its owner. So, without hesitation, he killed the lion. However, this didn't stop him from continuing to raise pets. Ivy understood the meaning behind the painting. He wanted Ivy to pledge loyalty to Egypt. As long as Ivy pledges loyalty to him, she will be rewarded handsomely. On the contrary, if she betrays him, she will be eliminated without hesitation, just like that lion. Ivy lowered her head and bowed to Befitu, offering her loyalty. Of course, Ivy would never betray Befitu, because Ivy returned this time to protect her well. Disguised as a tomboy with short, black hair, she prevented Befit from recognizing her, and then quietly reversed history. This was exactly what Ivy herself had hoped for. But why did her heart ache so much? The vows Befit once made to her were all gone in the blink of an eye. Ivy returned to ancient Egypt. I met Befitu again. In the months since she returned to the modern world, 5 years had passed here. The once passionate prince had become the cold pharaoh of today. The promises made back then had also vanished into thin air. For some reason, Ivy felt inexplicably sad. Later, Befitu chose not to return to the heavily guarded Memphis. Instead, he directly returned from the already defector Giza border to the capital, Thebes. Meanwhile, a large army was already waiting along the way to assist him. It turns out everything was part of his plan. The man before him was bold in warfare yet cautious in his actions. He trusted his people but always left a way out. Ivy simply couldn't imagine what had happened to change Befitu's fate. It led to his untimely death. In the blink of an eye, Ivy followed Befitu back to Thebes once again. What greeted Ivy's eyes was the breathtakingly magnificent city of the 100 Gates. She could hardly believe that this was the place she had visited not long ago. Is this the prosperous era that began after the coronation of Ramesses II, as the legends say? At that moment, Ivy also saw an old acquaintance, Lidahi. She was still as impossibly beautiful as before. In her daze, Ivy forgot her current identity. She instinctively followed Befitu's steps. Fortunately, Buka noticed in time, and he pushed Ivira into the corner. Ritaher reported the situation in the Giza region to Befitu. The rebellion was indeed planned by the Grand Prince, and Montes has already successfully suppressed the unrest there. The crowd below immediately began to murmur loudly. They condemned the Grand Prince's act of betrayal. Befitu raised his hand to signal for silence. He ordered Montes to immediately capture the Grand Prince. Anyone who disobeys will be executed without mercy. At the same time, he appointed a young talent to the position of Consul of Giza. Ivy couldn't help but marvel at how impressive Befitu truly was. He was unrelenting in executing those who betrayed him. Yet he was also unreserved in promoting young, capable individuals. Then Bifatu changed the subject. He mentioned that the Nile River was about to enter its flood season again. He also asked Ivy what her thoughts were on handling the virtuous farmers. As the focus of the conversation shifted to Ivy, Litahi couldn't help but shout out Nefertari's name the moment he saw Ivy. Ivy immediately felt something was wrong. Could it be that Litahi recognized her? A stir immediately arose around them. But only Bifatu seemed unaffected, as if nothing had happened. She urged Ivy to answer the question she had just asked. Ivy turned to look at Bifatu. He doesn't understand what the other party is thinking. Regarding the issue with Xian Nong, he had clearly proposed the same solution before. Has Bifatu really forgotten what he said to him? Or has he already forgotten about him? Infrastructure fanatic Bifatu decided to build a brand new city on the banks of the Nile. It was named Pyramus, a luxurious, unparalleled, and mysterious city that would only appear in legends 3,000 years later in murals. It was the new capital of ancient Egypt established after Ramses II ascended the throne. Then, Bifatu further praised Ivy, saying that although she was young, she was a rare talent. She announced that from that moment on, Ivy would be appointed as her scribe. It was only now that Ivy finally understood that Bifatu had deliberately made Ivy answer her questions earlier, to showcase Ivy's abilities in front of the ministers. Then, it would be natural to assign her a position. After the meeting was dismissed, Buka told Ivy about the danger he had just been in. It was really risky. When Buka said Nefertari was dead, he was actually lying to him. 5 years ago, after Nefertari went missing, His Majesty went crazy looking for him everywhere. He even alarmed Seti over it. As a result, any girl who resembled Nefertari was to be immediately executed. This ban was only abolished after the death of the late king. In Buka's eyes, Away was just a dark, unkempt brat. Lord Dithak must be blind to have mistaken Away for Nefertari. Just as they were talking about him, Dithak suddenly appeared behind them. Feeling guilty, Buka quickly said goodbye and slipped away. Litahi casually remarked, the two brothers from Mengtusi are so full of energy. Ai Wei subconsciously nodded in agreement when she heard this, but she quickly realized that her current persona didn't know Mengtusi. Ai Wei hurriedly gave a forced smile, trying to brush it off. However, Litahi didn't press the matter. He had come specifically to apologize to Ai Wei for his earlier rudeness in the main hall. But Litahi still thought, Avi does have quite a few similarities to Nefertari. Especially Avi's aquamarine eyes. Here, the Egyptians believe in reincarnation. No matter what a person becomes, you can always see the true soul through their eyes. Before leaving, for some reason, Litat sighed and said something strange. Luckily, you're not him. Ivy didn't think much about it. What puzzled her most was, even Rita almost recognized herself. Did Bifith also sense it earlier? But recalling his previous indifferent attitude, it didn't seem like he recognized her at all. Ivy immediately dismissed these thoughts. She had returned this time only to correct history. Isn't it better that he doesn't remember? Just then, Buka hurriedly ran back. He was holding a strange piece of clay with the inscription, He to you. The most terrifying thing was that the text on it said, Rebellion plan failed. Second plan to be implemented immediately. Bifatu used to think alone by this lotus pond every night. It wasn't until then that Ivy suddenly appeared, only to disappear just as suddenly. For 5 years, he searched every corner of Egypt, chasing every sign of movement. He would rush to every lead immediately, but each time, he came up empty. He took his anger out on everyone around him, and sent Matt, the young priest, into exile. He refused the marriage arranged by his father, until his father flew into a rage. He was to marry the foreign girl with golden hair. This was the first time Fitu experienced the feeling of unrequited love. Ivy was like an illusory reflection in the water. No matter how hard he tried, he could never reach her. In just a few months, but he would spend his whole life making up for it. From then on, he never spent a moment alone. Every night, he was either busy with politics and construction, or filling the midnight hours with nameless women. But starting today, for the first time, she dared to enjoy the solitude of the night alone. Bifith put down her wine glass, stood up, and a smug smile curved her lips. Because from today onwards, Bifatu can start thinking about things related to her again. At that moment, Ivy suddenly sneezed loudly. How could she sneeze in such hot weather? Could it be that someone is thinking of her? Ivy didn't think much more about it. Instead, she started thinking about this clump of earth. The rebellion mentioned should be the Giza rebellion from a few days ago. But that should only be a scheme between the crown prince and the Libyans. Why would this clay from Hutti be connected to this rebellion? And how could it have carelessly fallen into the hands of someone like Buka? This is a serious crime that could cost someone their life if discovered. Avi repeatedly examined the clay. In addition to the text he couldn't understand, there was also a strange symbol. According to Buka, it's an intricately carved lotus design. The owner must have been a person of high rank and power. But the lotus is the Egyptians' favorite flower, and the clay tablet is a symbol of crane script documents. Such a combination is quite strange. A private message that shouldn't be discovered by others, yet is boldly stamped with a unique silkscreen print. Ivy just finds it all incredibly confusing. The only thing we can be sure of right now is that someone is colluding with the crane ladder to try to assassinate Bifitu. A palace maid delivered this letter. The pharaoh invites them to join the celebration in 3 days. Avi and Buka exchanged a knowing look. This is a good opportunity. All the officials and nobles will be attending this celebration. They can take the chance to look for clues inside. Before attending the banquet, Ivy was forcibly taken to bathe and change by several palace maids. Ivy stared blankly at the strange oils in front of her. Just as she was thinking of picking one at random, one of the maids casually told Ivy to take off her wig and hand it over for cleaning. It turns out that in ancient Egypt, the use of wigs was already quite common. Ivy's mind was suddenly in complete chaos. The moment he thought that the other person had so easily seen through his wig, he couldn't help but wonder if everyone else had already noticed. After Ivy dismissed the palace maid who wanted to help her bathe, she took off her wig and let out a soft sigh. This was the first time Ivy had relaxed her body since returning. She recalled the hardships of her journey, not only enduring the scorching heat outside. At the same time, I have to carefully conceal my identity as a girl, although I never intended to pretend to be a boy. It's all Buka's fault, that idiot. From the beginning, he treated me like a boy, ordering me around. Now I'm too embarrassed to reveal that I'm a girl. As my skin gradually lightened, Ivy also remembered that the black spray she brought was almost gone. Initially, I thought I'd be able to go back soon. I didn't bring much back. Now Ivy realizes she had overestimated her own abilities. At the same time, she had underestimated the power struggles between the country's royal families. If Bifitu had arrived a little later, I would probably be dead by now. I came with the intention of saving Bifitu. But now, it's him who has saved me. Just then, an impatient voice sounded behind Ivy. He had only meant to urge Ivy that the banquet was about to begin, but he unexpectedly saw an incredible sight. After a brief exchange of glances, Buka kept saying sorry, at the same time scrambling out of the room. When he stopped, he began to recall Ivy's actions just now. A head of beautiful blonde hair, and that body like a lotus emerging from water. Buka finally realized Ivy was a girl. Blood gushed from his nose. Ivy, on the other hand, quickly put on her clothes and fixed her wig. Now she could only pray that the dense Buka hadn't seen clearly. But this damn Buka couldn't read the atmosphere at all. He kept stealing glances at Ivy along the way. He suddenly said he wanted to take responsibility for Ivy. Ivy saw that. He was about to reveal his secret about being a girl. He quickly covered Buka's mouth, telling him to pretend he saw nothing. Then they arrived at the ballroom. Ivy not only saw the breathtaking Princess Hecate again, but also another princess of Bifitu. The girl who is said to be able to converse with the gods. Manhwa, the younger sister of Bifitu. Ivy discovered that a friend in the palace was plotting to harm Bifitu. She decided to search for clues at this banquet. As soon as she entered, she saw the beautiful Mathiadnichiru again. The scene of Bifitu taking her as his concubine immediately surfaced in Ivy's mind. She felt a complicated and indescribable emotion. However, she had heard that Mathiadnichiru had been living in the cold palace these past few years. She no longer has the same boldness she once had when she defied the pharaoh. Ivy also saw another concubine of Bifitu, Manhwa. Not only is she Bifitu's sister, but she also has the legendary ability to communicate with gods. Thus, with the strong recommendation of the ministers and priests, Bifitu had no choice but to marry his own sister as his concubine. Thinking of this, Ivy felt a sharp pain in her heart. She doesn't understand where this emotion comes from. She just assumes it is jealousy from a sibling romance. Then, the main guest of the banquet, Bifitu, also walked gracefully into the hall. As he raised his glass and drank it in one go, the dinner officially began. On this celebratory day, Bifitu also prepared a gift to entertain everyone. It was a blessed auspicious object, consecrated by Manhwa to the gods. In this land where people believe in the blessings of the gods and the pharaoh's gifts, this divinely bestowed treasure naturally became something everyone fiercely competed for. At this moment, Ivy suddenly felt a gaze fixed on her, like being entangled by a cobra, a terrifying feeling. Ivy, to dispel that chilling sensation, immediately joined the scramble for the treasure. With the unveiling of the lid, a golden lion statue, shimmering with a golden light, appeared before everyone. Bifitu will bestow this treasure upon the most intelligent person tonight. Then, Egypt's foremost architect will pose a challenge, how to most conveniently and accurately measure the height of the Abu Simbel temple. The audience immediately launched into a heated debate. Some suggested using stones to measure, others suggested making a large ruler, and so on, but all their answers were rejected. At this time, Ivy raised her hand to answer. Those nearby couldn't help but criticize, saying how could this foreigner possibly understand their Egyptian scholarship. Ivy ignored their complaints. Instead, she said she only needed a small stick to measure the temple's height. First, she would place the stick vertically on the ground at noon. Then, she would simultaneously measure the length of the stick's shadow and the temple's shadow. Finally, using proportional calculation, she could deduce the temple's height from the stick's height. Ivy had studied these ancient Egyptian architectural foundations when she was doing her thesis. The architects were astonished. They immediately invited Ivy to join their architectural institute. Before Ivy could refuse, Bifatu announced that Ivy was his scribe, forbidding anyone else from poaching her. Then Bifatu walked towards Ivy holding the golden lion statue. Everyone was stunned on the spot. The pharaoh himself was bestowing a gift. This was a scene they had never heard of before. Bifatu closed in on Ivy. Ivy met those amber eyes at close range for the first time in a long time. Before she could react, Bifatu had already placed the golden lion statue in Ivy's hand. Before Ivy could react, he returned to his throne. However, as Ivy picked up the golden lion statue to examine it closely, she discovered that the lotus mark was engraved on the base. Could the person who tried to assassinate Bifatu really be in this hall? Ivy's identity was finally about to be revealed. Just now, Ivy once again discovered traces of the lotus article. This proves that the person who wants to harm Bifatu is very likely among the people at this banquet. At this moment, the playful Manhwa approached Ivy. After hearing his explanation about the golden lion statue, Ivy realized that the lotus article was actually stamped by Manhwa. However, this article is not exclusive to Manhwa. The Siamat number Nijiru is also using this article. To be precise, this is Wang Fei's exclusive article. At this moment, curious about what they were talking about, Bai Fai too also came over. Manhwa immediately and effortlessly hugged her. Ivy watched their interaction, and a sense of desolation began to show in her eyes. Gradually, even the surrounding voices became indistinct. In the next moment, Ivy's head began to spin. Then, her legs gave way. Her body began to fall uncontrollably. In a moment of urgency, Bifatu called out Nefertari's name. At the same time, he quickly stepped forward and caught Ivy before she fell. Everyone was stunned by the sudden turn of events. Nefertari. A name that had been buried for 5 years, one no one dared to mention. But suddenly, the name was spoken again from Bifatu's mouth. Manhwa was also quite puzzled as to why the king would shout that name. Looking at Ivy, who seemed a little flustered, Bifatu put away his usual cold demeanor. A faint smile appeared at the corner of his mouth. Then, under everyone's watch, he suddenly lifted Ivy up. Manhwa, standing nearby, was completely stunned. It's already strange enough that Brother Wang is calling a boy Nefertari, yet he still treats him like a prince. The ministers below the stage couldn't help but discuss this among themselves. Ivy, her face flushed with embarrassment, begged Bifatu to put her down. Bifatu ignored the awkward Ivy. Instead, he began to explain the situation to everyone. In the past few years, everyone knew she had been searching for a foreign princess. And today, she finally found her. The colleague who was speaking, Bifatu, pulled the wig off of Ivy's head. A head of beautiful blonde hair immediately appeared before everyone's eyes. Bifatu introduced the young girl in her arms as the rumored Nefertari. At the same time, he rewarded each person present with 10 gold coins for witnessing this moment. Excited, the crowd immediately shouted in unison, "Long live the pharaoh." However, amidst the cheers and excitement, Ivy once again felt that cold, piercing gaze. That person really did blend in with the group of officials. Then, Bifatu quickly left the banquet hall with Ivy in his arms. What does it feel like to think about the same person every day for 5 years? In these 5 years, Bifatu learned how to lead troops, fight wars, and govern the country. But he could never figure out why Ivy left. He thought, maybe it was because he was too rough and reckless. Maybe it was because he shouldn't have married a concubine. Or maybe it was because he shouldn't have given her that bracelet. So he learned to be gentle and considerate. He no longer married new concubines. He also shattered all the serpent-shaped golden bracelets in the country. He only wished for Ivy to never leave him again. While speaking, he bowed his noble head even lower than Biffy's. Ivy didn't expect that in the few months he had been gone, Bifatu has changed so much. With just a laugh, he can decide the life or death of a country. The future pharaoh. He's still so young. Except for the sun, he doesn't need to bow to anyone. Ivy couldn't help but ask when Bifatu had discovered him. Actually, Bifatu had seen Ivy for the first time on that small hill. I recognized him instantly. He gently touched Ivy's face and said, "You thought you could hide from me by wearing a wig and darkening your face? That's because you haven't tried. Every day for the past 5 years, I've been thinking of the same person." Ivy's face turned even redder, completely exposed. He asked Bifatu to keep her by his side as a Manjusri official. Was that all a test? Bifatu gave Ivy a light knock on the head. He saw Ivy deliberately disguising herself to hide her identity. Then I had no choice but to cooperate with his performance. Now that her identity has been exposed, Ivy no longer needs to be his scribe. Because that's a position only men can hold. Upon hearing this, Ivy immediately made a request to Bifatu. She hoped she could attend their meetings as an observer. She just wanted to stand beside them like an attendant. Ivy promised that she would never do anything that would harm Egypt. She hoped Buffett could trust her. Buffett gently ran his finger across Ivy's cheek, while holding his chin. It seemed that Ivy had already forgotten the promise he made 5 years ago when he was still just the pharaoh's son. Buffett looked at Ivy deeply, and said, "I am the pharaoh of Egypt now. I can give you everything you want. If it's reasonable. If you want one, I'll give you two. If what you want is unreasonable, then I can act as an unreasonable ruler. Whatever you want, I can fulfill it." Bifetu tightly hugged Iway, and once again begged him to stay. Faced with Bifetu's heartfelt confession, Iway was truly moved. He would stay at this moment, to save Bifetu's destiny. But one day, he will still go against Bifetu's wishes. How will he face that then? Since Iway's identity as Nefertali was revealed, Buka started desperately avoiding Iway. Avis, who is thick-skinned, didn't notice Buka's embarrassment at all. He just thought Buka was upset with him for not being brotherly enough. He hoped Buka wasn't falling ill. The most important thing right now is to find out who intended to harm Bifetu. Just then, Avis covered Buka's mouth as he tried to argue, because he spotted a suspicious figure in a cloak. And that person was none other than the old acquaintance, Lidahi. Iway hurriedly pulled Buka aside to hide, but he accidentally fell on top of Buka. Iway ignored Buka, who looked very flustered. Her mind was racing, wondering why Rite was sneaking around in the cold palace. Logically, the only people who live here are Mate, Heoni, and Jeru. A bad thought suddenly occurred to Iway. She had forgotten that Mate, Heoni, and Jeru are Hittite princesses, the holder of the lotus seal and the Hittite clay tablet. Her suspicion is undeniable. But why is Rita-He involved now? Then Bifetu suddenly appeared here, and Rita-He was actually following behind her. Ivy froze, unable to comprehend the situation before her. Meanwhile, Cab was in utter turmoil. He was actually so close to the pharaoh's beloved. He thought he was doomed this time. At this moment, Ivy still hadn't realized the severity of the situation. She just didn't know how to face Bifetu right now. So she randomly made up an excuse and tried to leave. But this only made Bifetu even more upset. He grabbed Ivy's hand to stop her from leaving. At the same time, he turned to order someone to send Buka back to Giza. He was never to leave again. The sudden change shocked Ivy. He knew Buka's greatest wish was to follow Fa Lao's example on his many campaigns. North and south, fighting on the battlefields. To become an excellent soldier like his brother, Mentis. Doing this now is tantamount to ruining Buka's future. Iway recalled how he had unintentionally changed the fates of others time and again. Iway felt incredibly sad. He wished he had never come here. And this perfectly mirrored Bifetu's suffering. He wouldn't allow Ivy to speak like that. Ivy was his most important first concubine. Not executing Buka was already his greatest leniency. He didn't understand why Ivy would still say such things. Bifetu forcefully pulled Ivy to a pillar. Then, without a word, he kissed her. Ivy immediately pushed Bifetu away. Blushing, she said that in their place. Only lovers with a deep connection can do something like this. Bifetu slammed both of his hands hard against the pillar. He really wanted to know how much longer it would take for Ivy to look at him. Bifetu hoped that Ivy would truly look at him. But in Ivy's eyes, it seemed like she was only looking at Bifetu's life. This made him feel a bit lonely. He forcibly lifted Ivy into his arms, and he walked towards a high platform. Atop the pavilion was the magnificent site of the Sinkabu temple. Bifetu introduced to Ivy. The sculpture in the middle depicts Egypt's greatest sun god. And standing side by side on either flank are their own sculptures. Bifetu's purpose in doing this was to prove before the sun god that he had considered Ivy his true wife 5 years ago. Besides, he is still planning the new temple at Abu Simbel. He wants the gods in the heavens and the subjects of future generations to witness all of this. Bifetu is holding Ivy. He wants him to remember his words. I will be the greatest pharaoh of Egypt, and all you need to do is watch by my side. It doesn't matter where you are or what you become. You will always be mine. Instead of being moved, Ivy feels more anxious. The Abu Simbel temple is a great monument from the reign of Ramses II. On his birthday and coronation day, divine light would appear. 3,000 years later, the statues of him and Nefertari will still stand here, vivid and lifelike. But Ivy believes she is just a fake Nefertari. That's why she frantically tries to stop Bifetu from placing her statue there. Bifetu couldn't understand Ivy's thoughts. She held on to a last shred of hope. She pleaded with Ivy to promise online, under the witness of the sun god, to be his concubine. Ivy knew she couldn't accept Bifetu's sincerity. She firmly believed her existence would only ruin Bifetu's future. At that moment, Bifetu felt he was truly going mad. He seemed also tired of Ivy treating him like a uni from the bottom of the Nile, wantonly abusing him. Since that day, although Bifetu would still take Ivy to some meetings, there was no communication between them anymore. Bifetu never again set foot in Ivy's residence or inquired about him. The maid who served Ivy, found this incomprehensible. He had heard their story from his sister since childhood. Everyone could see how happy the pharaoh was to see Ivy again. Put said his sister's name was also Nefertari. Originally, the late king intended to marry his sister and several other noble ladies to the pharaoh. Before Put could finish speaking, Ivy interrupted him. He repeatedly confirmed that Put's sister's name was Nefertari, and she was the most favored concubine of Ramses II. It seemed that Ivy had finally found a direction in correcting history. Now, he just needed to identify who wanted to harm Bifitu, and confirm the relationship between Litahi and Mathu, and the connection with Nijiru. In the end, she must return her position to the true master. Today, Ivy is disguised as a palace maid, because she is going to meet the true destined partner of Bifitu. According to Shept, her sister Neftali called off the engagement. She chose to become a priestess at the Sinkub temple. Not only is she beautiful, but she is also greatly liked by everyone. Ivy knew well that daughters of nobility receive various kinds of education from a young age, all for the purpose of one day becoming a princess. Now, because of her presence, all their efforts had been in vain. It led him to have no choice but to take up a religious position. Ivy once again felt an overwhelming sense of guilt for changing others' lives. Lost in thought, he accidentally bumped into a passerby. The water bottle in her hand flew into the air. Luckily, a passerby reacted quickly. He steadied Ivy, who almost fell. He also caught the water bottle. When Ivy saw the man in front of her, she was astonished. Because it was no other than her brother, Ivy. Ivy couldn't help but hug him tightly. In an instant, he poured out all his longing for his brother and home. Ivy never expected that her brother would truly fulfill his promise. Her brother had once said that as long as Ivy needed him, no matter when or where, he would appear to give Ivy a hug. But the man didn't seem to be her real brother. He said that although they didn't know each other, he didn't mind continuing to hold him at the market. Realizing the other person wasn't her brother, Ivy hastily pushed him away. The atmosphere became somewhat awkward. After all, Ivy was the one who hugged him first. No one else was to blame. At this time, Shep's shout came from afar. Ivy was thinking about meeting up with her, but the man stopped her with his hand against her jaw. Then he gently kissed her forehead. She also said she hoped to see Ivy's true face next time they met. After saying that, he turned and left. Ivy stood there, stunned. It all happened so suddenly. He never expected that in such a distant era, there would be someone so similar to Brother Sien. He didn't know whether this was luck or irony. Later, they arrived at Shep's home. Ivy finally met the real Nefertari. He was teasing the children. At that moment, he noticed Ivy and the others. He immediately recognized Ivy's blue eyes. Ivy had no intention of hiding it. He also openly revealed that he was from the year 3000. He accidentally borrowed the name Nefertari. He messed up history. Ivy hoped the other person would understand. She was the true beloved consort of Ramses II. As for Ivy's words, Nefertari actually didn't understand most of it. But he understood one key thing. That's the real pharaoh, Avi. Not Nefertari. It doesn't matter what her name is. She told Avi she shouldn't feel guilty. Entering the palace as the pharaoh's wife wasn't what she wanted. She'd much rather dedicate herself as a priestess and physician. Here, the Egyptians worship the gods. He believes it was all God's plan. The pharaoh has a passionate love for Ivy, and Ivy hopes the pharaoh has a bright future. These two things are not in conflict. Ivy just needs to face her heart now. She only needs to stay true to her own thoughts. How humble can one be when loving someone? Just look at the Egyptian pharaoh. Bitu is gazing at the custom-made golden gemstone necklace in her hands. She imagined Ivy wearing it. It would surely be beautiful on her. But the next moment, she recalled Ivy's heartless rejection. In a fit of anger, she tossed the necklace aside. It happened to land in the hands of Litahi, who was entering the room. She looked at the necklace in her hand, realizing she seemed to have arrived at an inopportune moment. But Litahi was also helpless. After all, he has important military intelligence to report. According to the report from Mentis, the Libyans did not support the Prince of Giza, who had already hanged himself before the city gates were breached. At the same time, Mentis also sent back another secret letter to Befit, telling Rite not to worry, that he can directly check the contents next time he encounters the same situation. Although he said so, Befit didn't really feel that way in his heart. They three have worked together for 10 years, never shying away from anything. But this time, Monta deliberately used a coded message. Could there be something he didn't want Rita to know? After seeing the contents of the coded message, Befito showed a moment of surprise. Immediately after burning the message, he told Rita its contents. Monta discovered the secret documents showing the Crown Prince's collusion with the Libyans in treason. He asked if it should be made public, even though Litak had doubts about it. He could not confirm the truth of the content. After reporting the work, he took his leave. Bifitu watched Litak leave, reminiscing about the contents of the letter. In fact, it was Montes who discovered the rebellion, and the Hittites were the true masterminds behind it. He was worried that there might be a Hittite spy in the palace. However, Bifatu didn't feel anxious about it. On the contrary, he found it even more interesting. His grandfather and father's greatest regret in life was that they couldn't expand Egypt's territory beyond the banks of the Nile. They even failed to stop the Hittites' relentless raids on their borders. This was the opportunity. Bifatu intended to use the sword in his hand to extend the protection of the sun god to the shores of the Mediterranean, along the coastline. At this time, Ivy returned to the palace secretly late at night. On the way, she also inquired about some other matters from Shept. When she asked whether Ritak had been seen entering or leaving the harem, Shept was quite surprised by Ivy's question, because as the high priest, Ritak should never appear in the harem. Even so, Ivy was still certain that she hadn't been mistaken that day. The person appearing in the cold palace is Rita. There must be some untold reason behind this. Could it be that Rita is not Egyptian? Shept immediately dismissed Iway's guess. Here in Egypt, a foreigner could never hold a religious position. However, Shept had heard a rumor. Rita is actually a mix of Egyptian and Hittite blood. It is said that he is the child of the late king's brother, who forced a Hittite captive woman to bear him. His mother committed suicide after giving birth to Rita. Ivy never expected Rita to have such a tragic rumor surrounding him. If the rumor is true, for Bifatu, Rita's existence would undoubtedly be a ticking time bomb. Just as Ivy was thinking about these things, a large hand quietly reached out to him from the darkness. Ivy became more and more suspicious that Litahi was the one trying to harm Bifatu. As she kept guessing what the other party's next move would be, a shadow in the darkness suddenly yanked her over forcefully. When Ivy came to her senses, she realized it was Bifatu. She gently took off Ivy's wig, and asked her where she had been. Ivy, a little irritated, said it had nothing to do with her. As soon as she said that, she regretted it. He doesn't understand why he has to go against Bifatu's words. Hearing this, Bifatu sadly released his hands. Seeing this, Ivy immediately turned around to explain. But she suddenly ended up close to Bifatu's face. She hurriedly stepped back. She explained that what she said earlier was just out of frustration. She hoped Bifatu would believe that she only wanted what was best for him. Ivy decided to tell Bifatu about the possible insider trader in the palace, and the person who wants to harm him is likely among those closest to him. Bifut showed little emotional reaction. He simply said, taking action rashly without solid evidence would only alarm the enemy. Avery could tell from Bifut's attitude that he likely already had a sense of who it was, but he still hoped she could help. Bifut told Avery not to worry about it. The best help she could give him was to protect herself. After speaking, he turned and left Ivy's room. That day, Litak, as usual, reported to Bifatu to confirm. He said that Hetty had sent an envoy to request an audience. The relationship between Egypt and Hetty is still quite delicate. He suggested that Bifatu handle it instead. Bifatu did not follow up on Litaka's topic. Instead, he spoke about Montes' commendable comments this time. He was thinking about how to reward Montes. Dithak recommended promoting Montes to governor of the 5 legions. However, Bifatu had a better idea. He wanted to reward Montes with a wife. At first, Dithak agreed, but when he heard that the bride-to-be was Mata Hanijaru, he immediately appeared surprised. Dithak thought this approach might be a bit inappropriate, but he couldn't come up with a better counterargument. Just as Bifatu said, everyone in the country knows that the pharaoh's heart belongs only to Nefertari. Mentuhotep has been completely ignored, never receiving any favor. Rita hesitates, saying, "Have you considered the queen's feelings in doing this?" Bifatu thinks. Rita seems to have forgotten something important. The purpose of the king giving Matanija to him back then was to humiliate Hittite. Now, marrying her off to his own subordinate general is an even greater insult to Hittite. And being able to take the most beautiful princess of the Hittite kingdom as a concubine, Mantas should be very happy too. That's settled then. Bifiktu is very pleased with this. He urged Rite to prepare for the meeting with the Hittite envoy. Today, Ivy disguised herself as a guard. She sneaked into the palace, because Bifatu was about to meet the Hittite envoy. Ivy was worried that the arrival of the Hittites was not for peaceful purposes. Anyway, no matter what their intentions were, she would stop anyone attempting to harm Bifatu. At that moment, Bifatu arrived at the store with Marconi and Jeru. However, Litahi, who usually stayed by Bifidu's side, was assigned to a seat far away. He realized that Bifidu had already begun to suspect him. Litahi also understood his own background. In such a critical moment, being suspected was inevitable. Then, the messenger from Hetty was summoned into the palace. A bearded man, holding an exquisite box, walked confidently at the front. His confidence stems from their crane ladder's strength, which is on par with Egypt's. But this man, Mumucha, he's less a diplomat, and more a warrior. And the man behind him is Tari. He's the one Ivy met on the street that day, the man who looked so much like Sien Gij. For a moment, Ivy thought the other person had recognized her. This was Tari's request to shake hands with the princess. Shaking hands with the most beautiful princess of the Hittites was the greatest reward for them. However, for some reason, Mateo Nijeru seemed to be very afraid. Ivy couldn't help but feel puzzled. How could an ordinary messenger make the Hittite princess? Are you that afraid? After receiving approval from Fitu, Matt Connier still looked completely clueless. He turned to look at Rita, seemingly seeking help. Watching their subtle interaction, Ivy was completely stunned. Had she been wrong all along? If these two really want to frame and trap Bifitu, then the two envoys present should be their accomplices. But why is Matt, the Marquis of Nijiru, so terrified? It's as if these two envoys are here to harm him. He trembles as he extends his hand. Tali holds Matt, the Marquis of Nijiru's hand, while speaking words of longing from King Hedabo. At the same time, she secretly slips something into his hand. They exchanged a glance at each other. Mathaus quickly retracted his hand along with the items. Bifitu, on the other hand, silently observed their interaction. Then, Mumu Cha said that they were here on King He's orders to visit Princess Mathaus. At the same time, they had brought a precious gift for Pharaoh. It was a symbol of the friendship between their two nations. It was a temple blueprint drawn by the finest artisans from their country. They knew Bifitu liked architecture. Mumu Cha also said he hoped to personally explain the blueprint to Bifitu. After the guards frisked him, they confirmed he was not carrying any weapons. Bifitu agreed to let him bring the blueprint over. But Ivy couldn't help feeling that the situation now was so similar to the story of the truth revealed at the end of the scroll. Could the weapon really be hidden inside that blueprint? Have you ever seen the Egyptian version of the story? The man in front of them was explaining the blueprint in his hand to Bifitu. Ivy, who was mixed in with them, worried that this guy might try to take the opportunity to harm Bifitu. So he pulled out the handgun he had brought from the modern world. But the thing he feared the most happened. The moment the dagger was revealed, everyone was stunned. Tari shouted loudly, trying to stop his companion from doing something foolish. But the angry Mamucha still didn't hesitate and swung the knife toward Bifitu. Years ago, Seti I killed his entire family. As a result, he harbors deep resentment toward Egypt and the pharaoh. Although Ivy was prepared in advance, the two of them got entangled, preventing him from aiming at Bifitu. He already knew Ivy was here. More than the danger before him, he was more concerned about Ivy's safety. The moment Bifitu was distracted while speaking to Ivy, Mumu Cha's dagger had already closed in on him. At the critical moment, Rite appeared in front of Bifitu. He blocked the deadly strike for him. Bifitu reacted quickly, drawing his sword and chopping off Mumu Cha's hand. He then ordered the guards to immediately drag Mumu Cha out and execute him. But because there was poison on the dagger, Rita lay on the ground, bleeding black blood. Matt rushed to Rita's side without hesitation. With a sorrowful expression, he cried out Rita's name. Rita weakly lifted his trembling hand. The man before him was the beginning of his life. He had decided long ago. Even if the world misunderstood or hated him, he was willing to swear to protect this man with his life. But he still had one regret in his heart, that he could no longer take his princess away. Once upon a time, there was a little boy named Bai. Orphaned, he lived with an old grandmother. Since he was very young, he learned theology under his grandmother's guidance. He once believed that as long as he became a great priest, then his father would be proud of him and come back to see him. Until the age of 14, she became the youngest priestess in Egyptian history. But because of her appearance, she was still bullied and ostracized by others. Grandma couldn't bear to let Bai continue lying, revealing that she was actually the child of the king's brother and a Hiting slave girl. After giving birth to her, her mother couldn't bear the shame and chose to. After learning the truth, Pierre ran out of the house like a madman. He prayed to the gods in the sky, hoping that it wasn't true. At that moment, a voice rang out. Instead of asking those mysterious gods who may not even exist, why not search for the truth on your own? A masked boy appeared behind him. The young man takes off his headscarf. He then says, "As long as you're willing to follow me, I can help you get the answers you seek." Since that day, Bifitu became something in Lidahi's heart that transcended faith. This is the scene of the first meeting between the two young men. The pair of eyes in Bifitu, filled with the aura of a king, once made by Bao in submission. He wanted to follow him, but he still held on to the last bit of hope for his father. He longed for his father to return, to tell him the truth in person. However, when he returned home, his grandmother, who had always been his only family, was already lying in a pool of blood. His grandmother was killed for revealing Bai's true identity. She was assassinated by someone sent by his father. Even Bai was about to be silenced. This moment not only completely shattered the last shred of hope in his life, but also crushed his faith in the divine. Even though Bifitu, who had followed him, saved him, there was not a single ripple in Bai's heart. He believed that, without hope and faith, he was no longer capable of helping Bifitu. Just as Bai was about to turn and leave, Bifitu firmly grabbed his hand, and said, "Then place your faith in me. Remember my name, Ramesses. This name will become the title of Egypt's greatest pharaoh. And you will become my most trusted first prophet of Egypt. Together, we will be carved in the walls of every glorious temple, revered by all. From now on, You are no longer Bea. You are Litak. Perhaps following these eyes would truly allow him to see a more real and expansive world. So he became Litak, by Batutu's side. Later, he witnessed Batutu being officially named the Regent Prince. At the same time, Litak, with his unprecedented wisdom, became the youngest first prophet. During a mission, he met a beautiful girl on the border between Egypt and Hittite. They developed feelings for each other. Although they didn't know each other's identities or names, they had still agreed to meet again a year later. But later, a foreign girl claiming to be Nefertari barged in here. This somewhat eccentric girl completely threw the young prince off balance. She seemed to be able to change Ramesses' life at any moment. Dita had once thought that perhaps it would be better if this girl disappeared. Unexpectedly, one day, she really did disappear. A lot happened in the following 5 years. Ramesses finally ascended to the throne as pharaoh. Dita always stayed by her side, always moving forward. She witnessed a broader and more captivating world. This was the belief in Dita's heart. But it seems that all of this is about to come to an end. The dying Dita collapsed in Bifitu's arms. He still apologized to Bifitu for leaving his seat without permission. Bifitu didn't understand why Rita was still smiling at him. Knowing he was suspected, he didn't clarify. Shouldn't he resent his master? Bifitu rebuked him, telling him not to talk nonsense. He still needed Rita's help with many things. Rita was grateful for having followed Bifitu for these years and seen many things beyond reality. He wished Bifitu all the best. He achieved his dream. In his final moments, he turned to look at Matnijduru. His beloved was right before him, but he could no longer protect him. He couldn't even utter a single word of farewell. Dite closed his eyes helplessly. No matter how Matnijduru called his name, he never woke up again. 10 years ago, the wise young boy swore allegiance to Bifitu until death. Now, he lies cold in his arms. For 10 years, they had grown accustomed to sharing their dreams late into the night, or galloping along the Nile, together patrolling the beautiful landscape of Egypt. In fact, Bifitu had long considered Rita his most trusted friend. Rita's dreams were his own. Now, Bifitu is filled with regret. He actually began to doubt the person who had just risked their life to protect him. Bifitu suddenly snapped back to reality. He realized it was all those damned crane ladder people's fault. He immediately ordered the remaining crane ladder messenger to be captured. And at that moment, they discovered that Tali had already taken Iway hostage in the corner. Iway secretly turned the gun towards Tali's abdomen. Harry seemed to already know that Ivy was holding a dangerous weapon. The knife in his hand was pressed tightly against Ivy's neck. He ordered Ivy to drop the gun immediately. With no other choice, Ivy had to comply. At this moment, Bifitu was radiating intense anger. Not only had his best friend died right in front of him, but now, even the one he loved most was being held hostage. Ivy felt incredibly guilty. It was all because of her willfulness and carelessness that had put Bifitu in such a passive situation. And Tali's conditions were also clear. Just prepare a horse for him, and let him leave the city. He also lightly cut a wound on Ivy's neck. A provocation. Bifitu, look at the original. Nefer. Tali's blood is also red. Seeing this, Bifitu couldn't help but feel nervous. In Ivy's opinion, Tali is even similar to her wise brother in her unscrupulous methods. But precisely because of this, Tali is even less like her brother. Because no matter how many tricks my brother has, he would never use them on Ivy. And just when Bifitu had given up resisting, and was about to fulfill Tali's request, Ivy secretly took off the pendant from her neck, and quickly sprayed something directly into Tali's face. It was a wolf-repellent spray that can instantly knock someone out. The moment Tali fell, the guards swarmed forward, wanting to kill him. Ivy immediately stood in front of everyone, because he still wanted to get the truth of the real traitor from Tali. Now that it's confirmed that Ritak is not the traitor, the real traitor must still be hiding by Bifitu's side. Bifitu also realized that everything happened because of the traitor's presence. That's why he doubted Ritak. And in the end, he had him killed. Thinking about this, Bifitu was also determined to find the person who truly caused Litahi's death. He agreed with Ivy's suggestion not to execute Tali for now, but his emotions still wouldn't settle. No matter who the traitor was, the Hittites could not escape involvement. He decided that, even if it meant starting a war, he would make the Hittites pay the price. The princess she deeply loved became the pharaoh's concubine. She helplessly watched her suffer humiliation in the cold palace. But Litahi always prioritized loyalty. At this moment, Ivy finally understood why Litahi occasionally showed hostility towards her. Thinking of Bifitu's lonely figure made her feel short of breath. Ivy began to think about what to do next. Perhaps I should visit that poor princess first. Just as he stood up and was about to leave, he suddenly remembered another key figure in this incident. A moment later, Ivy hurried to the royal dungeon where the dangerous criminals were held. It was filled with various secrets and legends. And Ivy found the person he was looking for. Tali, covered in wounds, was weakly imprisoned in the cell. Tari didn't expect Iway to come here. The the legendary, renowned Nefeltari. Only then did he truly see Iway's real appearance. Iway didn't intend to chat with him. He came this time to clarify a few things. From the palace's series of actions, Iway guessed that Tari wasn't an ordinary envoy. Her status was clearly higher than that of Mumudia, even surpassing the princess. Even if she hasn't said anything yet, Bifatu probably already discovered it. Tali's lips curled slightly, revealing a mischievous smile. Although she knew Ivy was trying to get information out of her, she still gladly told Ivy. Her real name is Yali, but he didn't expect that Ivy knew nothing about her own name. Such a brave person in the palace. Could she really be just an ignorant little girl? Yale became more interested in Ivy. At this moment, Ivy wanted to make a deal with Yale. She took out a stainless steel badge she had brought from the modern world. It was harder than ordinary metal. With it, her chances of escaping would be slightly improved. The relative Yali wanted to tell him who the real traitor inside the palace was. Yali found it increasingly interesting. He then mentioned an unexpected name to Iway, Yamanla. She was not only Bifatu's sister, but also his concubine. It was obvious to everyone how much he adored Bifatu. Iway couldn't understand why Yamanla would collude with Et to harm Bifatu. Yali, too, was completely confused. They never planned to assassinate the pharaoh. Egypt is a powerful empire. It can't be destroyed by killing a single ruler. All along, the king has wanted to see the princess, and bring her back home. Yet, the princess endured humiliation and insisted on staying in Egypt. So, their purpose this time is to rescue the princess. As for why Amenra cooperated with the Hittites, Ivy still hasn't figured it out. Yari just said he voluntarily approached them. After learning the truth about the mole, Ivy followed through with the deal and threw the stainless steel badge to Yari. At the same time, she refused his request to return to Hittite together. Ivy helped him this time, only because Yari really resembled her brother. But that was the only reason. Since he is in opposition to Bifatu and Egypt, the next time we meet, he will be an enemy. Watching Ivy walk away, Yali seemed a little disappointed. He is the supreme pharaoh of Egypt. Yet he fasted for 5 days over the departure of one subject. Since Ritea's death, Bifatu has locked himself in his room. No one knows whether he is alive or dead now. When Ivy heard this, she immediately rushed to the pharaoh's chamber. Outside the room at that moment, everyone was waiting helplessly, not knowing what to do. Seeing this, Ivy scolded everyone on the spot. The pharaoh hasn't eaten or drunk for 5 days and is still unmoved. Perhaps something has already happened to him inside. Avery immediately arrived at the door and began pounding on it wildly. She also shouted at Bifatu, telling him that if he was still alive, he should hurry and open the door. The others were all stunned, their faces filled with disbelief. They could never have imagined that anyone would speak to the pharaoh like this. Avery suddenly turned around. He angrily rebuked everyone. What are you still standing there for? Quick, go find someone to break the door open. At that moment, a sound of the door opening came from behind. Ivy turned around to look. It was none other than the critically injured Biffy. Though his expression was a bit sorrowful, his body appeared to be in relatively good condition. The first thing Bifidu said after opening the door was to inform everyone that he had decided not to go to war with Hetty for the time being. To think about this decision, Bifidu locked himself in his room for 5 days, using radical methods to torture himself in order to maintain his sanity. On one side was avenging his loyal subjects, on the other was the peaceful life of the people and the nation. In the end, Bifidu chose the latter. Montes immediately expressed his agreement with this approach. The pharaoh had only inherited the throne less than a year ago. If he wanted to completely eliminate the massive Hetty, the primary task now was to steadily and orderly strengthen the nation's power and enhance the fighting ability of the noble families. The famous Battle of Kadesh in history should have occurred 5 years after Ramses II ascended the throne. Ivy was very anxious about this. What he was most worried about now was whether Bifidu could survive until that moment. He asked with concern about Bifidu's condition. Bifidu smiled slightly. He took Ivy's hand and walked toward the room. Although he stubbornly insisted that he wouldn't starve to death, Ivy thought otherwise. Even though he always possessed extraordinary mental and physical strength, he was still only human. As a human, he needed food. Bifidu was very happy to see Ivy come to visit him. She stopped Ivy, who was trying to explain. She knew Ivy had a reason for coming here, but he still saw it as Ivy coming to see him. Ivy also sat down beside Bifidu and looked at him seriously. When you think about it, he's only 25 years old. At such a young age, he had to suppress his emotions to maintain his composure and rationally assess the nation's fate and decisions. Ai Wei, imagining Bifidu shouldering the same lonely burden in the future, instinctively reached out to comfort and help the man. Just then, a guard rushed in with a report. The crane man in the dungeon had escaped. Bifidu had to suppress his emotions for the sake of the nation. His lonely figure made Ivy unable to resist wanting to comfort and help him. But just then, the guard brought in an urgent report that the Hedian in the dungeon had escaped. Ivy didn't expect that Yali had really escaped just with that small badge. The guard at the gate would probably soon reveal the whole story. At that time, with Schefter's personality, he would definitely take full responsibility. The guards were still angrily accusing the person who helped Yali escape, saying that it must be the real traitor inside the palace. Ivy was startled. Wouldn't that make her a traitor? Biffitu noticed Ivy's subtle actions. He ordered that he would personally interrogate her. He told everyone else to leave. Ivy had considered telling Biffitu that the real traitor was Yamala, but she didn't have more evidence. Her word alone wouldn't be enough to convince anyone. Before leaving, Biffitu glanced back at Ivy. He allowed Ivy to do anything she wanted. As long as Ivy stayed here. But is this really okay? Since Ivy returned to ancient Egypt, the course of history has deviated again and again. It's as if she were a pebble thrown into the torrent of history, disturbing the calm flow. Gradually, she lost herself in it. Baitar was assassinated by a poisoned blade. Montes was shot to death by stray arrows. Even Biffitu fell in front of her while protecting Ivy. Ivy suddenly woke up. It turned out it had all been just a dream, but now was not the time to rejoice. Ivy quickly ran out of the room. He finally realized how foolish he had been. He was already caught in the torrent of history, yet he always tried to view it from a detached perspective, thinking he could single-handedly turn the tide. Then he would put on the bracelet, and leave here as if nothing had happened. But now it's too late. Ivy's heart already bore the indelible mark of Fitu. He has always been unwilling to admit it frankly. He feared that his feelings would bring disastrous consequences. But because of this, Ai Wei decided to confess his feelings to Bai Fitu, no matter what the outcome may be. He was willing to bear it. He would no longer evade it. But it seemed everything was too late. A large number of soldiers gathered in the square. Biditu was making preparations for the war. The full-scale war between Egypt and the Hittites was about to erupt, since the day Rita died. It felt as though everything began to move uncontrollably. There was still a chance to reverse it, but Yali's escape only set everything in motion once again. Throughout history, the struggle between Egypt and the Hittites has never stopped. It wasn't until the reign of Ramesses II that this long conflict finally ended. However, this war was originally supposed to happen 4 years later. Yet, it has been brought forward by more than 4 years. Ivy is very frustrated about this. In this catastrophe, how can she ensure that Biffitu survives? With Biffitu's mobilization, a full-scale war between Egypt and the Hittites is about to break out. Ivy didn't understand why, after just one day, things had already developed to an irreversible point. It was only then that he learned from Shep that Biffitu had put sleeping pills in his food. He had been unconscious for 3 days. Although Ivy had expected that he couldn't deceive the suspicious Biffitu about letting the tooth go, he didn't understand why Biffitu hadn't come to confront him. Instead, he had just let him sleep for 3 days. This left the already weak Ivy utterly confused. However, what happened next was even more incomprehensible to him. A beautiful woman appeared beside Bifit. This person was Shepet's sister, Nefeltari. "Oh, Set, grant your power to these brave warriors. Lead the great Egypt to a glorious future." He was praying to the gods for this expedition. During Ivy's slumber, Nefertari had replaced Ridahet as the current high priestess of Egypt. Ivy stared intently at the two on stage. They would forge an immortal love that would be praised by the world for millennia to come. 6 years late, but they had finally met. The divinely protected soldiers seemed full of strength. They shouted in unison, "Hail Egypt!" At this time, Mentuhotep made a request to Bifit. He said he could recommend someone who could help Egypt achieve a great victory. That person was his younger brother, Buka. Last time, he was sent back to Giza by Bifit, for getting too close to Ivy, never to leave. This time, Buka heard that the pharaoh was going to personally lead the army to attack Heracleopolis. He was willing to die to make his point. He also wants to serve the country. Driamta Saint praised his brother's determination. This could help them achieve a great victory in Egypt. After a moment of thought, Biffitu surprisingly appointed Buka as the deputy commander of the Set Legion. That was the most elite and courageous force among Pharaoh's 4 main legions. Biffitu ordered Buka to lead the first wave of attack immediately. Charge into the battlefield. This demonstrates his determination and courage. Mentis Wanyen was startled. Even Ivy understood. Buka, with no experience in war, going on this expedition was tantamount to suicide. He understood Biffitu's intentions, to deliberately show weakness to the Hittites, thus luring the enemy deeper. But why choose Buka? But he's Montes' own brother. Isn't this pushing himself to a point of inhumanity and injustice? Ivy doesn't understand why everything is spiraling out of control. She only wanted Ramses to live a good life. And for him and his true beloved concubine to create a legendary tale for the ages. Now everything is heading in the direction she fears most. Ivy knows she can't stay lost any longer. She must set history back on the right path. In order for Biffitu to survive, and for history to return to its proper course, Ivy decided to take immediate action. She found Montes, and tried to persuade her to let her join the campaign. Montes dared not bring the pharaoh's favorite concubine to the battlefield. She refused Ivy's request, citing that women should not fight in wars. But the real reason for her refusal was something else. Menta doesn't trust Iwe. Rumors have recently spread through the palace that Iwe is the traitor. They say he colluded with the Hittites to deceive the pharaoh. He killed Ritha and released the Hittite prisoners. Iwe quickly clarified that he is not a traitor. During the days they were devising the battle plan, he was in a coma. The real traitor is one of those who now knows the entire plan. Ivy heard that before they set out, the priests would divine good or bad fortune based on the departure time and battle route. Mentas didn't understand Ivy's meaning. After all, Rite was no more. Ivy didn't beat around the bush. She directly named Yamala as the girl who could speak with the gods. Every time the pharaoh set out, he would pray to the gods for blessings. Therefore, he will have a corresponding understanding of the march plan. Ivy showed Mendas the Hatini map with the Lotus article on it. She also shared the information she learned from Yari. She knew it would be hard for Mendas to believe her, but this also concerns Buka's life and death. She guaranteed it with her own life, hoping that Mendas would take her along on the expedition. But just then, a guard delivered urgent news. The pharaoh has been assassinated. Upon hearing this terrible news, Aiwei's legs went weak. He only managed to stay upright with Mentu's support. Fortunately, it was said that Befetu was not in mortal danger, and the assassin has been apprehended. It was indeed Madhornijuru. The two of them immediately rushed to the scene after hearing this. When Aiwei saw that Bifai too was still alive and well, he finally let out a sigh of relief. Meanwhile, Madhornijuru was kneeling on the ground. Aiwei didn't expect the assassin to really be him. At this moment, an elder stepped forward and reproached Aiwei. A mere servant dares to appear in the main hall? In desperation, Ivy had no choice but to take off her wig. She said she was only here to see the king. Bifetu gave her a gentle look. Ivy instinctively turned her face away. Hadn't Bifetu already stopped trusting her? She self-mockingly thought, since she had even resorted to sleeping pills. Why should she still hold on to these pointless fantasies about him? At this moment, Aiwei saw the copper sword that had fallen to the ground. He immediately realized that copper itself is toxic to cells. If the wound is too deep and not properly treated, it could still be life-threatening. Just as Aiwei was about to persuade him to let him handle the wound, Nefertari also arrived in the Great Hall. The two who had once desperately wanted to be together. Now, they are separated by life and death. The beautiful princess has long lost the sharpness she once had. From today onward, he will renounce the right to his own life. He will serve the god of death and reincarnation for the rest of his life as Bibi. Here in Egypt, he can still worship the rebirth of Bifetu. It must be because he hopes they will meet again someday. This is a relief for the princess, too. From the moment they met, they deeply imprinted each other in their hearts. Now they can finally be together forever, legitimately. Ivy felt guilty again for changing others' destinies. Thinking of this, he couldn't help but recall letting Arlie go. Could this also lead to irreversible consequences? His muttering to himself caught Monta's attention. He nervously asked Ivy to confirm the name of the crane ladder messenger. When Monta heard the name, Yale, he was completely dumbfounded. Ivy certainly didn't expect that she had let such a powerful figure go. A few years ago, the Hittite king was just a weak and incompetent ruler. But in recent years, Hittites' comprehensive national strength has been rapidly improving. It wasn't their king who orchestrated everything, but the true ruler behind the king. In the Hittite palace at this moment, the king paced restlessly, because that person was about to return. As an announcement sounded from outside the door, a figure appeared at the entrance to the hall. This person was Yale, who had just escaped from Egypt. Faced with Yali's salute, the king did not dare to neglect it at all. He asked Yali to sit down first. At the same time, he ordered everyone else to leave. Yali initially refused the king's invitation to the celebration banquet, since he was about to rush to Syria immediately. Moreover, he estimated that the Egyptian army would reach the Sinai Peninsula in a few days. The king heard that Egypt was coming to attack Hatti. He was immediately flustered. Yali assured the king that there was no need to worry. As long as the king gave the order to send troops, he would handle the rest. He requested 5,000 soldiers and horses from the king. He guessed that the pharaoh would use 5 legions in this campaign. This was the perfect opportunity to strike a heavy blow to Egypt's morale. He was determined to ensure that one of Egypt's legions would not return. Before leaving, Yali remembered something. The inscrutable Shengzan's investigation of Mu truly revealed an unexpected person. This king personally chose the people to accompany him, almost causing him to die in Egypt. The king immediately apologized repeatedly, saying it was just an accident. Finally, Yali also told the king that he had personally delivered the poison to the princess. Looking at Yali's arrogant demeanor, the king could only fume in silence. Ariadne, a man whose skills and strategies rivaled Ramses himself, was initially helped because he resembled his brother. He was helped just once. Unexpectedly, he is the true ruler controlling the Hittite Empire from behind the scenes. And now, the place Buka is about to attack is Mini, a stone's throw from the Sinai Peninsula where the Hittite army is stationed. Sending Buka against such a powerful opponent is tantamount to suicide. Meanwhile, in the Mini frontier region, Buka, leading the vanguard, was repelling a small enemy force. He thought, as long as he kept winning like this, he would not only gain the pharaoh's favor, but Avi would also look at him differently. Buka quickly shook his head to dispel these thoughts. Now was not the time to daydream. He ordered 100 men to stay behind to support the Set Legion. Then the rest followed him and continued advancing. On their way later, Buka rescued many displaced Egyptian refugees. But strangely, until they were almost out of food, they hadn't encountered a single soldier from the crane ladder. At this point, the guard told him, "Ahead is Syrian territory." Buka knew he had chased too far. Retreating and waiting for his brother's support would be the right choice now. But if he did that, he would forever just be Mengtas's little brother. Buka didn't want to be just someone's little brother. He wanted to achieve greatness. With his own hands, gaining the pharaoh's favor, is the only way he qualifies to stand before Iwe. So Buka waved his hand, leading his troops into Syria. But just then, the Hittite army's flag rose in the distance. They suddenly attacked from all sides, surrounding Buka's troops. The number of soldiers far exceeded their expectations. Worse still, black flags with the insignia of a general appeared in the enemy army. This meant that the opposing force was led by Ariognoer, the first general of the Hittites. Buka froze on the spot. He couldn't even think about strategy or formations anymore. Ari slowly approached Buka. He came to the first battlefield with a faint glimmer of hope. He thought he might run into that mischievous little girl here. Since he's not here, there's no need to hold back. Yari raised his hand, just as Buka thought he was going to meet his end here. A familiar voice came from not far away. "Buka, you idiot." Both Yari and Buka were stunned by the sight before them. A golden figure was seen on horseback, holding a flag high. Behind him, a sea of red flags fluttered in the wind. Buka looked on in disbelief as Ivy led the Set Legion to rescue him. Just when Buka was in dire straits, Ivy appeared with the Pharaoh's elite Set Legion, arriving just in time. Aside from his astonishment, Buka couldn't help but feel confused. The Set Legion's ranks should still be pulling chariots. Even with high mobility, it's impossible to catch up to his vanguard so quickly. Ivy urged Buka not to hesitate. "Hurry up, we'll explain later on the way back." Yali watched Ivy riding towards the battlefield. He became even more interested in this special girl. This was completely different from her weak appearance when they first met. Yali ordered them not to pursue. He didn't want to face the Egyptian Set Legion head-on so soon. But one person didn't think that way. A bearded man believed it was just the enemy's trickery. He requested to lead troops to pursue. Yali had no impression of this person at all. He simply thought the man had an annoying face. He chuckled softly. Then he assigned 1,000 soldiers to him. He also specially reminded the bearded man not to pursue too aggressively. In Yali's current mind, whether it's controlling Heti or defeating Egypt, nothing is more interesting than keeping Ivy by his side. But the problem is, the other party happens to be the pharaoh's concubine. If an international dispute arises at this time, it wouldn't be appropriate. Just as Yali was getting into the idea, his subordinate beside him broke his train of thought. He worried that the bearded man's troops would be annihilated by the Egyptians. Ari didn't care. This meeting was just both sides probing each other. As long as the bearded man obeyed him, everything would be fine. Otherwise, consider it a gift for Ivy and Egypt. On the other side, Buka stopped Ivy. He didn't understand. Since the Set Legion has already arrived, why not fight back? Why are we retreating instead? It was then that Buka learned from Ivy that the real Set Legion hadn't arrived yet. Ivy just used the fastest horse and rider to bring the flag. Buka saw the numerous bruises on Ivy's body. Only then did he realize Ivy couldn't even ride a horse properly. Yet she rushed to save him, risking so much. Buka silently vowed in his heart he would repay Ivy someday. Later, when the bearded man found the flag planted in the ground, he thought to himself, this is clearly the Egyptians trying to trick us. That position of first general should never have gone to Yali. He's not a crane ladder man. He'll never be loyal to the crane ladder. Huzi ignored Yali's warning. He ordered everyone to continue the pursuit. When he saw the crimson flag again in the distance, he thought the Egyptians were trying to trick him again using the same tactic. But when he drew closer and saw the figure, like that of the Grim Reaper, it is already too late. After a series of horrifying screams, Montes reported to Bifitu that they had annihilated all the Hittite soldiers who had been chasing them. Bifitu was not concerned by this. He only asked where Ivy was now. In ancient Egypt, every warrior becomes an adult at 18. They will all choose a master, and swear lifelong loyalty to him, following their master blindly, regardless of right or wrong, for a lifetime. But the person Buka originally wanted to pledge allegiance to was always the Pharaoh. However, Ivy's sudden appearance caused him to waver. His request to go on this expedition is to gain glory, and thus resolve his inner conflict. He hopes Ivy will stop confusing him. However, at this moment, Kaka was surprised to find that Bifatu had silently appeared behind them. Ivy also couldn't help but wonder why Bifatu was here. Shouldn't he be staying in Thebes with the real Nefertari at this time? Does such a small-scale border conflict really require the Pharaoh to personally lead the troops? When Ivy had left Thebes, he had already made up his mind. Since history could no longer be changed, what he could do now was to rescue Buka, find out the truth behind Manhwa, then leave here, go back to the future. Ivy turned around and glanced at Bifatu. To her surprise, Bifatu looked very angry. Ivy instinctively turned and ran. She didn't understand what she had done to make Bifatu so angry. Bifatu immediately mounted her horse and chased after Ivy. Since Ivy's return from ancient Egypt, he's always felt that Bifatu might have something like Bell's palsy. He never shows any emotion on his face. But this time, Ivy clearly saw an angry expression on Bifatu's face. Ultimately, Ivy's two legs couldn't outrun the horse's four. Bifatu grabbed Ivy and hoisted her onto the horse's back. Ivy didn't understand why Bifatu was so angry. He clearly did nothing this time. Bifatu, enraged, told Ivy to shut up. He asked seriously about the relationship between Ivy and Yali. Ivy immediately explained that he had met Yali no more than 3 times. At first, he didn't even know Yali was such a powerful figure. Letting him go was just to exchange information about the traders. Bifatu couldn't help but ask why Ivy cared so much about the Egyptian traders. It was none of his business. The same question made Iway a little upset. In a fit of frustration, he said that whatever happens in Egypt has nothing to do with him. He just didn't want to see Bifatu in danger. Iway reminded Bifatu to be extra careful, even with the people around him. He also said he would go back eventually. Hearing Iway say he was leaving, Bifatu suddenly hugged Iway tightly. Iway once again felt Bifatu's unusual anger. But he still insisted that he would leave sooner or later. He also said that it was Biffy who didn't trust him first. She even gave him sleeping pills. He didn't care to stay here. They were never people from the same world. Ivy became more and more agitated as she spoke. She even said that everything here was just a false mirror image. It was only after she finished speaking that Ivy realized she had said the wrong thing. Bifetu slightly curled the corner of his mouth upon hearing this. He gently lifted Ivy, then put her down on the ground. Although Bifetu had expected things to be roughly like this, he hadn't expected Ivy to use such words. At this moment, Ivy felt the urge to tell Bifetu the truth. But would anyone believe such an absurd thing? Hesitating, Ivy finally told him she was from the future. Ivy finally revealed to Bifetu that she was from the future. Bifetu didn't doubt her at all. When he saw Ivy again on that small hill in Giza, he had a premonition. 5 years had passed for him, but time hadn't left any trace on Ivy. Everything about her was just as it had been when they first met. Ivy desperately shared her experiences with him. He hopes that Bifetu can believe that everything he did was to help him. However, Bifetu doesn't care about any of this. All he can think about is how Ivy can easily go to places he will never reach, wearing the golden bracelet. Maybe the next time they meet will be decades later. Or perhaps Ivy never intended to return at all. Bifetu cannot let such a thing happen. He grabs Ivy's hand and asks her from how many years into the future she comes. Ivy thinks Bifetu is asking this because he wants to know Egypt's future. So he honestly said he was from 300 years in the future. However, Bifetu then suddenly blurted out that Nefertari was the traitor. He explained to a bewildered Ivy. If Ivy hadn't insisted on treating his wounds instead of Nefertari that day, Nefertari would have been executed for treason on the spot. Bifetu told Ivy he had never doubted him. At that time, rumors began circulating in the palace that Nefertari was a spy, so Bifetu found someone to impersonate the Nefertari in the rumors. He looked at Ai as if he hadn't properly remembered what he had said. So, Bifetu once again confessed to Ai with deep emotion, "I am already the Pharaoh of Egypt. Everything you want, I can give you. As long as it's reasonable. If you want 1, I'll give you 2. If what you want is unreasonable, then I can be an unreasonable ruler. Even if what you want is my life, I can give you everything. As long as you're willing to stay by my side." To hide her embarrassment, Ivy quickly changed the subject. She asked Bifetu what he originally planned to do with Nefertari. Bifetu kissed Ivy's neck. As he answered her, Nefertari conspired with his sister to release Hetty. The sinner approached Pharaoh in the guise of a priest. He took the opportunity to poison him. He committed treason, a capital offense. Bifetu also said that he had already arranged before leaving to have Nefertari and his sister executed in a few days, so that Ivy could remain safe. Bifetu would clear all obstacles. If Ivy still wants to leave, then he will kill Buka and everyone else. Ivy finally understood the reason for all the strangeness. He appointed Nephilia as a priestess, ordered Shept to give him sleeping pills, sent Buka to the battlefield and gave him an important position. All of this was part of Bifitu's plan, laid out long ago. He wasn't joking. If Ivy insists on leaving this time, Bifu will really kill everyone. Ivy couldn't help but ask, is this a threat? Bifu lowered his noble head, gently leaning on Ivy. He spoke the harshest words in the gentlest way. Yes, I am threatening you. Otherwise, what other way do I have to stop you from leaving me? This is the second time the Egyptian pharaoh bows his noble head to a young girl, in front of the world. The once invincible Bifu now has to tread carefully for the sake of a real person. He may be forced to pretend to threaten others out of helplessness. In this moment, Ivy's heart is deeply moved. It turns out that in this world, the person he is most reluctant to part with is not. It was Shept and Buka, not them. It was the man in front of me. Here, Ivy was risking being torn apart by the millennium-long divide. Yet, she experienced an unprecedented sense of happiness. Until then, Ivy realized she was so reluctant to leave Bifu. She realized that she had fallen deeply in love with him. Ivy made up her mind and said, if I stay, will Bifu stay with me? To hide her shyness, Ivy turned her head and said, after all, I have no relatives here. Meanwhile, Bifu couldn't believe his ears. He didn't expect Ivy to actually agree. Bifu was excited like a child. He lifted Ivy high. Then he kissed Ivy deeply on the lips. Biff told Ivy to go to the nearest Memphis immediately. They would hold the ceremony there right away. He promised Ivy that they would attend various events together from then on. Their portraits would appear together in murals. Their statues will also stand together on the temple. He wants to make Ivy the greatest queen of Egypt. Even the world 3,000 years later will witness their love. At this moment, Ivy was truly moved. Bifu's promise was so beautiful that it frightened Ivy. She felt like an intruder who had accidentally disrupted the destinies of others. And Bifu still has his imperial ambitions and grand life to fulfill. Although Ivy would never see her father and brother again. But here, he experienced a happiness that transcended what he once couldn't bear to part with. Bifu gently put Ivy down. He received Ivy's usual bag from the guard. Then he took out the serpentine gold bracelet from inside. This was Ivy's key to time travel. But this alone, Bifu couldn't let Ivy keep. Then Bifu swept his hand. Order everyone to immediately set off for Memphis. Now Ivy really has no choice but to stay in ancient Egypt. But a sense of unease lingers in his heart. Can he truly stay here and be with Bifu forever? Can you believe it? The Egyptian pharaoh isn't just in love. He's actually suffering from severe, straight male cancer. Ever since Ivy agreed to stay in ancient Egypt, Bifu quickly took her to Memphis to prepare for the wedding ceremony. As soon as they entered the town, Ivy was immediately captivated by the bustling market in front of her. Her body began to stir with excitement. Seeing this, Bifu immediately held Ivy tightly. He said Ivy would soon be the queen of Egypt. She couldn't be wandering around in a place like this. Even Ivy is not allowed to take off the headscarf on her head. Bifu has completely started to think of himself as Ivy's fiancé. Now, when Ivy thinks back, it seems like she only agreed to stay in ancient Egypt. She never said she would marry Bifu. In fact, Bifu didn't even give her a romantic proposal. He never consulted her opinion. The more Ivy thinks about it, the angrier she gets. He complained that Bifu's style was basically late-stage, toxic masculinity. Soon after, they arrived at Memphis Palace. It had luxurious decorations that rivaled those of the capital, Thebes. The maidservants led Ivy to a room. As soon as the door was opened, Ivy was immediately stunned by the sight before her. The room was filled with a dazzling array of clothes and accessories. Each piece looked so valuable. Ivy carefully thought back. Since he returned to ancient Egypt, he hadn't dressed up properly. He had been wearing clothes that were neither masculine nor feminine. But the main reason was that Egyptian women's clothing wasn't convenient for walking. So Ivy declined the luxurious outfits offered by the maidservants. He pointed to one of the maidservants and requested that she give him a set of the same clothes. After bathing and changing clothes, Ivy felt refreshed. But he soon started to feel a bit bored. He thought to himself, if Sheput were here, then they could sneak out of the palace and play. The maidservants didn't expect that the pharaoh's favored concubine would be such an unusual young girl. To relieve his boredom, the maidservants called in a group of skilled singers and dancers. This was Ivy's first experience of these ancient Egyptian performances. She found it quite interesting. Meanwhile, in the council hall, Bifu was discussing the matter of marrying the queen with the ministers. The thorny Bifu wanted to set the date for 3 days later. But the ministers, based on their observations of the stars, determined that a good day would be 15 days from now. Moreover, the ceremony to marry the queen was very complex. They would need at least 10 days to complete the preparations. However, Bifu doesn't care about any of this. To avoid prolonged delays, he made it clear that no matter what, the wedding ceremony must take place in 7 days. The day when Ivy swears before the gods to become his wife. Bifu has already waited too long. He doesn't want to wait another moment. As long as the Nile keeps flowing, and the sun keeps shining, my devotion to him will never fade. Ivy vows to be Befetu's wife forever. Befetu has waited so long for this day. To avoid the endless obstructions from those old ministers in the capital, Befetu decides to hold the wedding ceremony in Memphis 7 days later. But right now, Befetu has another important matter to attend to. The Hittites' ambush of Buka's troops was clearly premeditated. This proves there's a traitor within the Egyptian high command, who leaked their military plans to the enemy. Therefore, Bipito decided, from this day forward, all military plans would only be decided by him and Mentuhotep. Soldiers would only be informed the day before departure, and it is forbidden to tell the priests the marching route. After finishing the work, Befetu came to the courtyard where Ivy was. At this time, Ivy had already fallen fast asleep after a wonderful performance. Seeing this, Befetu picked Ivy up, and gently held her in his arms. Although it is common knowledge that the pharaoh dotes on Nefertari, everyone still finds it hard to believe that the pharaoh would show such a loving gaze. In a daze, Ivy was still praising everyone's performance. In a good mood, Befetu let everyone go to receive their rewards. At this moment, everyone was full of hope for Egypt's future. With this tolerant, kind, and beloved girl as Egypt's queen, it would certainly be a wonderful thing. Later, when Ivy woke up in a daze, they suddenly found Befetu's sharp-featured face right before their eyes. They were still sleeping on his arm. Avid was immediately embarrassed and blushed. He hurriedly asked Befetu why he was here. Befetu acted as if he couldn't care less. After all, this was his palace. He was free to sleep wherever he liked. He even told Avid there was no need to be shy. After all, sooner or later, they would be sleeping together anyway. As Avid was still thinking about how to retort, Befetu told Ivy to hurry up and bundle up more tightly, because he was about to take Ivy out to the market. When she heard they were going shopping together, Ivy's eyes immediately lit up. She excitedly mentioned something about it being their first date, which Befetu couldn't quite understand. On her way to change clothes, she almost tripped over a bottle. Watching this worrying yet heartwarming scene, Befetu secretly made a vow to himself. He will always be with Ivy, no matter what. What is it like to date an Egyptian pharaoh? Looking at the bustling market in front of her, Ivy was just about to let loose and shop till she dropped, when Befetu suddenly grabbed her from behind. Then she wrapped Ivy up in layers of scarves, inside and out. She turned Ivy into a tightly bound Zongzi princess. Befetu ignored all of Ivy's complaints. They don't allow Ivy to show even a bit of skin. Not far away, two beautiful women noticed them. Or rather, they were captivated by Befetu's irresistibly handsome profile. With just one look, they understood each other. Then they flanked him from both sides. They bumped into Befetu while pushing Ivy aside. Their starstruck expressions immediately made Ivy furious. Without a word, he pulled Befetu away. He clung to Befetu like an octopus. He glared at the two girls who had just tried to chat him up. He clearly looked like, "He's my man. You can't even look at him." Ivy said matter-of-factly, "Where they're from. That's how you walk on a date." Befetu didn't care how the others walked. His focus was on whether Ivy had ever gone on dates like this with others before. Ivy wondered how it came to this. He immediately changed the subject. He talked about his name. Nefertari was actually a temporary name he'd used back then. Then he told Befetu his real name, Ivy. After learning this truth, he called out Ivy's name for the first time. This gave Ivy a strange feeling. Then, Ivy began drawing on the ground. She explained to Befetu, "Ivy is the way of rose. It's also her favorite flower. Ancient Egypt liked to use hieroglyphs." She hoped Befetu would remember. This flower is Ivy's name. Befetu smiled faintly. He agreed to Ivy. Ivy instinctively turned away. Recently, whenever Befetu looked at him, he couldn't help but blush and his heart raced. His heartbeat quickened. At this moment, a guard suddenly approached Befetu. Ivy only then realized that someone had been following them during their date. However, his attention quickly shifted to the guard's words. "Princess Manhwa has arrived in Memphis. She is the real traitor who conspired with Crane Ladder, the one Ari had mentioned. Now that he has walked right into his trap, Ivy can take the opportunity to expose his true identity. She is the girl who can speak with the gods, guided by the will of the divine. He is always able to accurately predict the future. Because of this ability, Amanra was able to marry her beloved royal brother, just as she wished. This time, when she came to Memphis, although she originally said she was here to congratulate her royal brother on his marriage, the oracle told her that Ivy cannot become the queen of Egypt. The gods say the blonde girl does not belong to Egypt. His arrival will only bring war and misfortune to the kingdom. Amanra's words perfectly captured Ivy's pain. In fact, his presence has been changing the fates of others. Even if the divine realm sounds absurd, Ivy couldn't refute it. Amanra also said that if her brother insists on doing this, Ivy could undergo a divine judgment. God will decide whether he is suitable to be the queen of Egypt. These words made Befetu furious. He warned Amanra to stop speaking nonsense. Stay in Memphis for the next few days. But Amanra believed she was only faithfully conveying the will of the gods, for any lie would cause her to lose the ability to communicate with the gods. Amanra bowed and then left the great hall. Ivy curiously asked Bifatu what the judgment of the gods was. However, Bifatu did not want Ivy to understand such matters. She just said it had nothing to do with Ivy. Later, Ivy learned from Buka that the so-called judgment of God involves locking a person in a confined space for a day and a night, and letting God decide life or death. Ivy believed this judgment was clearly unreasonable. There were too many human interfering factors inside. Ivy thought, what if I were locked in the confined space? Wouldn't that make it easy for someone to assassinate you in the middle of the night? Ivy also wants to know why Yamala is called the girl who speaks with God. It turns out that 4 years ago, when Yamala was only 11 years old, one day, she accurately predicted the Hittite army's movements in the border market. Though at first, nobody took it seriously, but as the number of predictions increased, similar to the Hittite military campaigns, or a high-ranking official being assassinated by the Hittites, every prophecy of Amanra was eventually verified by facts. The former king was absolutely delighted by this. He immediately had a discussion with the priests. From then on, Amanra earned the title of the Maiden Who Speaks with the Gods. Ivy immediately realized that almost all divine realms were related to the Hittites. Actually, if you think about it from the opposite perspective, it's easy to see the clues. It's just that no one has ever thought in that direction before. Although the motive is unclear, there's no doubt that Amanra is the traitor by the pharaoh's side. Seeing Ivy deep in thought, Buka asked if Ivy really wanted to be queen. That might bring envy from others. And the pharaoh's love may not be eternal. Ivy certainly understands these things. She doesn't care about being a queen. Right now, she simply wants to be with Bifatu. The identity of Amanra as a traitor to Egypt is about to be exposed. That night, he secretly entered the pharaoh's study. Just as he was about to steal the orders for the expedition to the crane ladder, Ivy and the others caught Amanra red-handed. But even with the evidence in hand, Yamala still felt she hadn't done anything wrong. She believed her actions were simply following God's instructions. Ivy saw no falsehood in Yamala's clear eyes. Because she so believed in the God in her heart, Ivy couldn't even bear to tell Yamala the truth. The so-called girl who spoke with God was actually a scheme the Hittites had been implementing for 4 years. The Hittites deliberately revealed some small-scale plans to Yamala, and when it comes from the princess's mouth, the Egyptian people will believe she possesses some mystical power. Amenra considers this utter nonsense, because he has never revealed any information about Egypt to anyone. He maintains that he has only ever communicated with the god. Ivy knows Amenra isn't lying, because the problem lies with that so-called god. Ivy asks Amenra to describe the god's appearance. Egyptians and Hittites look very different. It's easy to tell them apart by their appearances. Yenera pondered. He had only met the god once. Since then, he had only been in contact with lesser deities. He only remembered the god having a pair of sea-blue eyes. Years ago, the god Ammonius Ra promised to make him someone special, and thus gain the right to stand beside his elder brother, the king. Therefore, the young Yamala firmly believed that the man must be the god Yeriagnal. Suddenly, a voice sounded. At this time, Bifatu also arrived here. He continued the conversation, revealing the two characteristics of the lord behind the Hittites, Yeriagnal, a black flag and ice-blue eyes. Yamala couldn't believe it was true. He so hoped that someone could tell him that the man was not Yeriagnal, but every single thing points to the god he has always believed in being his older brother's greatest enemy. Aman glared at Ivy's blue eyes. He remembered the day his fate was changed. Young Aman was playing when he suddenly encountered a mysterious person. The person provocatively asked Aman if he was someone who could keep a secret. Aman was furious. He swore on the spot, "If you can't do it yourself, you'll never be able to marry King Brother." Such a naive vow couldn't help but make the person laugh. Yamanla was even angrier at the person's rudeness. She angrily turned her back, not wanting to deal with it anymore. But then the person said something that shocked Yamanla. "I can make you someone special. I can help you realize your wish of marrying your king brother." In ancient Egypt, marrying Ramses II was every girl's dream, including his sister, Amenra. When he was 11, a self-proclaimed god promised to help him fulfill this desire. From that moment on, Amenra had a sacred duty to convey the god's will to the Egyptian people, and also to report all of Egypt's movements to the god. Ultimately, Amenra became not only a girl who could converse with the god, but also fulfilled her wish of marrying her beloved elder brother in the name of a divine marriage. Therefore, she believed in and revered the god's words even more deeply, until she learned of Ivy's impending marriage to Bifatu and becoming the queen of Egypt. Amenra fabricated a divine oracle for the first time. She lied, saying that the blonde girl could not become the queen of Egypt. Her arrival would bring misfortune to Egypt. Although he was initially filled with unrest, with the postponement of the ceremony, Amenra saw the false divine realm taking effect, even more effectively than he had imagined. He increasingly understood how important the title, "The Girl Who Speaks with the Gods," was. Therefore, when the god approached him again, and asked him to continue revealing Egypt's next military movements, Amenra knew that doing so would harm Egypt. But in order to preserve his ability to communicate with the gods, he desperately sought the divine instruction manual that the gods wanted. However, he never expected that what he would uncover in the end was a terrifying truth. The god was actually Egypt's greatest enemy. The girl who communicated with the gods was merely a traitor used by the crane ladder. With his last glimmer of hope, Yamanla begged his kingly brother to tell him that none of this was true. However, what he received was an unprecedented outburst of anger from Baifitu. He drove everyone out of the room. At the same time, he announced that everyone present must forget what happened today. If anyone leaked it, they would be killed without mercy. Looking at his younger sister kneeling on the ground, filled with regret, Baifitu concernedly asked Imanla if there was anything else she was hiding from him. However, when Imanla looked up and saw Ivy behind Baifitu, he seems to no longer regret the things he did in the past. Over the years, he has dealt with all the women who clung to Bifitu. The women that His Highness once favored are no longer needed. The women His Highness married do not love him. The woman His Highness loves does not deserve to stand by his side. They all deserve to die. Yamanla believes that even though she is no longer the girl who could speak to the gods, he is still the one who should stand by Bifitu's side the most. Suddenly, Amanra drew a dagger and stabbed Ivy, because even if he blocked his ears to avoid listening, or confused his mind to stop thinking, as long as the blonde girl in front of him was still breathing, Amanra could feel that no matter what he did, his beloved king brother would never care. Yamala raised his bloodied hands. He vowed to curse Ivy with his last breath, so that she and Biafitu would never be together. Not long ago, Yamala suddenly drew a short sword and lunged at Ivy. He knew well that as long as the blonde girl was alive, he would never receive his brother's affection. In that critical moment, Bifitu blocked Amanra's short sword with his bare hands. However, before anyone could react, an even more unexpected scene unfolded. Buka raised his sword without hesitation and pierced Amanra's body. Mengtusi reprimanded Buka's actions. He couldn't understand why his younger brother would be so ruthless towards the princess. But Buka, with a determined look in his eyes, said, "Attempting to assassinate the pharaoh is treason and a capital offense. Even the royal family must not commit such an act." Ivy doesn't understand why Buka has become so heartless. Now, all he can do is prevent Buka from drawing his sword. Otherwise, Yamala will die immediately from blood loss. But at this moment, Yamala seems to have become indifferent to life and death. Death to him is merely a transition from one world to another. He is not afraid of death, but he fears that he will never see his beloved elder brother again. If it really happens like this, he at least hopes Brother Wang won't forget about him. Yenera suddenly started emitting a creepy laugh. He ignored Bifitu's pleas. Resolutely, he pulled the sword out of his body. Blood immediately gushed out, flowing uncontrollably from his body. It stained his hands red. Yenera raised his blood-soaked hands. With his last breath, he cursed Ivy. "Nefeltari, I curse you to be separated from him, just as I am. I curse you to be worthless in his heart, just as I am. Unless that person dies for you, this curse will never disappear." Amanra's curse enraged Bifitu. He warned Amanra to shut up. "Don't say any more." Amanra, in the final moments of his life, he could only watch sorrowfully as his lifelong love glared at him for another woman. He stepped forward and grasped Bifitu's hand. The dagger stuck in it was a gift from Bifitu when he was a child. Now Amanra pulled the dagger out. "My king, please remember, only you can kill me. It is your ruthlessness that killed me." After saying this, Amanra unhesitatingly ended her life. Bifu couldn't stop her in time. He could only watch helplessly. Amanra fell into a pool of blood. He hated this world. He hated this kingly brother. He didn't love his own world. Ramses II lost completely. His beloved sister, beguiled, eventually died tragically before him. His loyal friend, suspected by her, lost his love and life. He never expected that a playful scheme, a joke hidden in a tooth, would lead to Befitu's utter defeat. Since that day, Avi hadn't seen Baifitu for 3 days. She was trying on various wedding dresses as usual. The etiquette instructor's words were making Avi struggle to stay awake. So Avi suddenly ran out of the room, leaving everyone behind. She was actually worried that Baifitu would hurt himself like Lidahi did after the incident, to suppress the pain in his heart by causing himself harm. When he reached the entrance to the pharaoh's chambers, Avi had thought that Baifitu would stop everyone from seeing him, just like last time. She never expected that he had already given the guards instructions. Ivy could skip the formalities and go straight to see him. It was at this moment that Ivy realized that Betheft had been waiting for her all along. At that moment, Betheft was sitting alone in a chair, gazing into the distance. The lonely figure made Ivy feel an unexpected sense of sadness. Is this the ending she had always wanted? After all the time spent on speculation, doubt, and entanglement, In the end, it was lightly defined as a farce. Ivy hugged Bifatu from behind. She had come back here to correct history and save her life. But many things still remain unanswered. It's not even clear whether Bifatu's life was successfully saved. Ivy had originally come to comfort Bifatu. She didn't expect that she would start crying first. Bifatu pulled Ivy into his arms. He gently wiped the tears off Ivy's face. Bifatu no longer troubled himself with the past. He asked Ivy about his own matters. He wanted to know everything about Ivy. Ivy couldn't help but smile. After all, it was a complicated world that couldn't be explained in just a few words. Ivy began talking about some things concerning modern society. He also mentioned that he had once written an article about Ramses II. He was a great monarch who led Egypt to prosperity. When he mentioned having over 100 wives and descendants, Bifatu frowned slightly. He embraced Ivy tightly. Simultaneously, he promised, "From now on, I will only have you as my wife. How many children you can have will determine how many descendants I have." After hearing this, Ivy also recalled giving Bifatu a tight hug. Actually, from the moment she decided to stay, she had already made up her mind not to care about how history would change. So whether Bifatu begged her like a child not to leave, or said she would become colder and more ruthless in the future for the struggle for power, Ivy's mind would not change. No matter what happens, he will always stay by Bifai's side. The man traveled thousands of miles to the ruins of Memphis. There is an ancient legend here. Anyone who drinks the water of the Nile will return to Egypt. At the moment when Aicien took a step forward, the once desolate ruins became bustling with voices. The crowd around them shouted the names of Ramses and Nefertari in unison. Aicien looked on in disbelief at everything happening before him. Then, something even more unexpected happened. Two elegantly dressed figures walked out of the main hall. One of them was his missing sister. She was walking easily with an unfamiliar man. Aicien couldn't bear to imagine what was about to happen next. At that moment, the guide's shouting pulled Aicien back from his daze into reality. The scene just now was so clear. Aicien could hardly believe that it was just an illusion. She left the guide behind and walked into the ruins alone. She knew that the secret of Ivy's disappearance must be hidden inside. Aicien arrived at an old shop. It was here that she had bought the bracelet she gave to Ivy. She wanted to know more about that bracelet. The man didn't answer directly. Instead, it began telling a story. Over 100 years ago, 4 young British men came here. They bought the mummy of an ancient Egyptian princess. Unexpectedly, the buyers suffered misfortune one after another. Later, the mummy was donated to the British Museum. As a result, disasters began to occur there as well. Helpless, this mummy was sent aboard a giant liner bound for New York. However, the liner sank in the Atlantic with 1,500 passengers. That liner was the infamous Titanic. And the mummy's name was Amenra. Though the story sounds interesting, Aicien wasn't interested. Because Princess Amenra's curse had long been dismissed as a rumor. It was merely a misinterpretation by the priestess of Amon-Ra. Aicien stopped the man from continuing to make up these boring stories to sell the product. He said he wasn't there to buy anything today. However, Aicien had been misunderstanding something all along. The only thing this shop sold was a single item. It was that snake-shaped gold bracelet. Upon hearing this, Aicien immediately questioned the man as to why he insisted on selling that gold bracelet to him. He even pulled out a gun and pointed it at the man. The man wasn't intimidated. He continued, "While that ridiculous story is indeed a rumor, the 4 young Englishmen who originally bought the mummy did exist. One of them was killed in a car accident. One died in the war. One died of a serious illness. And the last one walked into the vast desert. No one ever heard from him again. And that man was the last one. He has been guarding Princess Yamala's mummy here for 117 years. He cannot die. Nor can he leave this room. All these years, Aicien is the only person who has ever entered this room. He thought that as long as Aicien took the bracelet, the curse on him would be lifted. But he never expected that Aicien actually had a blonde-haired, blue-eyed sister. At that moment, a voice echoed in Aicien's mind. The person was calling out Nefertari's name. The man immediately panicked and knelt before the mummy's coffin. "Please forgive me, princess." Then, a figure walked out of the coffin. At the same time, they spoke some curse incantations against Nefertari. And she was Princess Amenra, who had died 3,000 years ago. The girl who walked out of the mummy's coffin was once Pharaoh Ramses II's beloved sister. After 3,000 years of slumber, she awoke for revenge. She woke up again. This bizarre scene immediately made Aicien feel uneasy and nervous. And for a moment, Yamala froze in place. Because the man before her looked exactly like the man who had used him and stolen his happiness. Arianir. What's even more ridiculous is, he is now that woman's brother. Yamala couldn't help but burst into laughter. Aicien has no memories of his past life. Therefore, he doesn't understand what the monster girl in front of him is saying. His instincts tell him that she is very dangerous. So, he shoots at Amanra's arm. But Amanra's arm actually completely detaches from her body. Then it falls to the ground, instantly turning to ashes. Then, Yamanla completely ignored the many bullets Aishin fired. He directly approached Aishin. For all these years, he had been guarding the gold bracelet, waiting for the blonde girl's appearance, and then kill her. But he didn't expect that the man would sell the bracelet to someone else. Aishin had no idea what Amanra was talking about. What he did know was that Goldenswa had taken Ivy away from this world. This left Amanra just as confused. Could it be that the one who sent Nefertari to the king's side was actually him? When he heard the name Nefertari, Aishin felt a sense of familiarity. He had mentioned this name when he discussed Ramses II's favorite concubine with Ivy. He had brought it up before. Yamanla screamed wildly upon hearing this. He immediately began shouting furiously. He would never admit that the woman was the king's favorite concubine. Yamanla raised his right hand. The air around him began to grow strange. The man kneeling on the ground then said, "The golden bracelet is the key that connects time and space. As long as the golden bracelet disappears, the absurd time and space will vanish as well." After he finished speaking, the man dissipated into the strange air. Yamanla continued his dance. The surrounding spacetime seemed to become distorted. Asleep for 3,000 years, he only waited for an opportunity, and this hateful man before him could also be that opportunity. "Hurry and thank me, Yaria Agnor. I will send you to your beloved sister now. The Memphis that spans 3,000 years. Please grant my request. Let this cruel man taste the flavor of pain. Let him be the one to trigger my curse." Before Acehen could react, a strange light engulfed him and he disappeared from this time and space. "Would you be the wife of Egypt's greatest pharaoh?" Before a sea of roses made of gold, Befektu softly pleaded with Ivy to be his queen. To give Ivy a romantic proposal. Befektu disregarded local customs and brought Ivy here at the last moment before the wedding ceremony. Ivy's mind was in a whirl. She hastily pushed Befektu away and ran off. To cover up her inner shyness, Ivy blushed and said that where they are from, it's customary to kneel on one knee during a proposal. Bifta thought to herself, what kind of strange ritual is this? Here in Egypt, people only kneel to the god Ammonius Ra, because the god has given them everything, and no one has ever dared to ask the pharaoh to kneel. Ivy also realized she had talked nonsense a bit too much. But just as she turned to explain, Bifetu had already knelt before Ivy and the shining rose. For Ivy, he was willing to do anything. He took Ivy's hand, asking her to be his one and only wife. Ivy didn't expect Bifetu, the greatest pharaoh of Egypt, he would go to such lengths for himself. Ivy's eyes were already wet with tears. She rushed into Bifetu's arms. With heartfelt sincerity, she said, "I'm willing to give up my future, and stay here forever. I'm willing to be your wife, and always stay by your side." They embraced beneath the sea of roses, until the wedding ceremony officially begins. "Oh, ancient Nile River, great Ammonius Ra, please witness this great love. From this moment on, Bifetu is the husband of Ivy, the spirit, and she will be his only wife." Yet, at this romantic moment, strange thunder suddenly boomed in the sky above the scene. The cheering crowd below instantly froze, becoming motionless as statues. Then, a lightning bolt struck beside Ivy, accompanied by Yamala's curse. A man suddenly emerged from a rift in spacetime. For a moment, Ivy thought the man before her was Arianir. But she immediately realized it was actually her brother, Aishin. Ivy immediately stopped Bifetu from drawing his sword and charging forward. She explained that it wasn't Yari, but her own brother. But with the sound of a gunshot, Bifetu immediately collapsed into a pool of blood. Then, regardless of Ivy's wishes, Aishin forcibly took him into the rift in space and time. They had once drunk the waters of the Nile. They promised never to be apart. But their promise could not break the rift of time and space. Everything unfolded just as Amanra's curse had foretold. His boundless hatred spanned 3,000 years of Memphis's time and space. It became the curse that would forever keep Ivy and Befetu apart. The supreme pharaoh of Egypt marries a girl from the modern world who traveled through time. Their future seemed so beautiful. But under Amanra's curse, everything became a bubble. His endless hatred brought Aisyen to ancient Egypt. He not only shot Befetu, wounding him, but also forcibly brought Ai Wei back to the modern era. When Ai Wei woke up again, she was lying in a hospital bed. He immediately checked his phone and learned that Befetu's history had reverted to its original state. Ramses II not only lived to be over 90 years old. In his lifetime, he married over 200 concubines. Among them, the most favored was Nefertari, the priestess of Ammonius Ra. Their figures appear in various murals and temples. Ivy was fortunate to live to a ripe old age, far beyond Befetu. However, he could not feel happy, because history recorded nothing about him. Had Befetu no longer needed him? Ivy looked at her brother, full of sadness. "Brother, I'll never see him again." Since then, Ivy became silent and withdrawn. No matter how kind Ai Xian was to her, hand-feeding her delicious food or giving her expensive gifts, Ivy couldn't help but remember the promises Bifatu had once made to her. At this moment, the television news broadcast a report that caught her attention. It's the Rose Wall. That's where Bifatu proposed to Ivy. He wants to go back there. There must be an answer he's looking for. Ai Xian doesn't understand why Ivy has changed like this. He pulls Ivy into his arms. He begs Ivy not to think about that person anymore. He says he can give Ivy the same promise. The person connected to her by blood. Avery had once been so infatuated with him. In the history of Bifatu, there's no longer a place for her. Perhaps forgetting everything, and accepting her brother's good intentions would be better. But Avery still pushed Ai Xian away, because she had already promised Bifatu to stay by his side forever. Seeing that Avery had made up her mind, Ai Xian didn't try to stop him again, but chose to accompany Ai Wei to Memphis. Although the Nile River still flows tirelessly forward, the once glorious kingdom, brighter than the sun, no longer exists. Ai Wei ran through the crumbling ruins. And even though this place had been shaped by 3,000 years of wind and rain, he still found that wall in an instant. In the age without roses, this is the best proof of his existence. This is the best proof of his past existence. Suddenly, Ivy was attracted by one of the stones. He once told Bifatu that the flower represented Ivy's name, and the heart shape represents love. The combination of the patterns means Ivy. This is Bifatu's remembrance of her. She didn't believe that such a beautiful picture could easily break their vows. According to the original history, he was supposed to marry hundreds of concubines. Just then, the stone loosened and fell down. To her surprise, hidden inside was a snake-shaped golden bracelet. This was the key for Ivy to travel through time. In the world 3,000 years later, the young woman once again found the rose wall the pharaoh had left for her. This is where Ivy and Bifatu once made their promise. She accidentally discovered that the golden bracelet was hidden inside the wall. This is the key that is crucial for Ivy's journey through time and space. Ivy's brother already realizes what she intends to do. Although the wall has weathered the ravages of time, one can still sense the thoughts hidden in each flower. Ivy can feel that the man must also value her just as much as she values him. He wants to protect her. She also understands that in Ivy's heart, nothing can fit except that person. She gently kissed Ivy's hand, and promised that no matter where Ivy goes, he would always appear by Ivy's side, protecting her, just like now. After saying this, Ai Xian turned away in pain. He also reminded Ivy, the golden bracelet is the key that connects time and space. As long as the golden bracelet disappears, the fictional spacetime would also return to its original state. Then Ivy disappeared in a flash of light. He found himself back in the vast desert. He looked at the crack in the gold bracelet. He thought to himself that the bracelet would probably break with one more use. Ivy looked around. He couldn't tell where he was. Exactly. Just then, a caravan passed by. According to the leader, this is Syria, and it's only half a day's journey from the capital, Damascus. After confirming that the Pharaoh of Egypt was still Ramses, Ivy finally felt relieved. The man curiously asked whether his golden hair and blue eyes were real. After getting Ivy's confirmation, the man hesitated for a moment. Then he gave Ivy a camel, and told her that as long as she kept heading southwest, and circled around the Red Sea, she would reach Lower Egypt. However, it was from this encounter that Ivy learned that it was already the 5th year since Ramses ascended the throne. Another 5 years had passed from the day they met. For Ivy, it was just a fleeting moment, yet 10 years have passed here. Ivy couldn't imagine what the time difference would cause. Now, he only hoped to return to Bifatu's side as soon as possible. However, he soon ran into trouble. Ahead, a group of soldiers were chasing a man. The iron swords in their hands were a symbol of Lahidi in this era. When Ivy immediately turned and tried to flee, it was already too late. He fell to the ground. His scarf fell off with him. When the crowd saw Ivy's golden hair, they immediately realized she was most likely the girl Lord Yali had been searching for. And they also noticed that the camel was the very one ridden by Lord Tut. Ivy never expected that Yali had been looking for her. Never did she expect that the kind leader from earlier was actually a member of the Hittite army. He is now heading farther and farther away from Egypt. Away's heart was filled with unease and guilt. Would she still be able to meet Bifatu this time? The young girl traveled once again to the world 3,000 years ago, to meet with the pharaoh. During Away's brief absence, 5 more years had passed here. What's worse is, he might never see Bifatu again after returning this time, because as soon as he returned, he was captured by Yali's subordinates. The moment he saw Yali again, Ivy could still see her brother's shadow in him. But in the end, he was just the ruler behind the crane ladder. Yali Agnol. He only told Yali that he had been home for the past 5 years, but he didn't say where he went. Yale was a little curious why Iway hadn't changed at all, but he didn't intend to investigate further, because after seeing Iway again today, He understood something. A man persistently searching for a woman he'd only met a few times. 5 years had passed, yet he still maintained his initial interest. Just touching his cheek elicits an indescribable emotion. Right now, he only wants Ivy. He doesn't care about anything else. Ivy hurriedly pushed Ari away. She said she was already the Queen of Egypt. It's impossible for her to return to Hedi with Ari. But Ari advised Ivy not to hold out hope for Egypt anymore. Damascus has already been captured by their forces. As the most important strategic point between the two countries, this will put Egypt in a very passive position. Ivy doesn't understand why Bifatu is still sitting idle in Memphis. Yali also told Ivy an even more shocking piece of news. Ramses has never taken a queen. Egypt has already forgotten about the blonde, blue-eyed Nefertari. Even if Ivy returns now, she could never become his queen. Ivy couldn't believe it was true. Even if the whole world forgets about her, she couldn't believe that Bifatu would forget the beautiful vows they shared, unless she witnessed it with her own eyes. Yari didn't stop Ivy. Instead, he chose to go with her to Egypt. However, he made a bet: if that person really doesn't need you anymore, you must wholeheartedly return to Hedi with me. They chose to leave immediately that day. Unlike Ivy, who was full of anxiety, Yali seemed unusually happy on the journey. The stars in the sky looked like beautiful jewels. Ivy didn't quite understand Yali. As the monarch behind Hedi, is it really alright to leave like this? Yali still looked indifferent towards the crane ladder, because he wasn't from the crane ladder at all. He was a Canaanite. Some also called them Phoenicians. Ivy certainly knew about this people. They were the first naval superpower in human history. They had brilliant minds. They were skilled in trade and commerce. However, Yali did not become a great maritime merchant. It was because the foolish son of the Hittite king was dissatisfied with the goods they brought. As a result, his parents were killed by the king. Yali only sought to avenge his parents. That's why he secretly controlled the Hittite empire. From the beginning to the end, he never cared about the future of the Hittites. Yali revealed his true identity to Ivitan. She comes from the Phoenician people, who dominate the seas. But she was only a child adopted by her parents. She didn't know where she truly came from. Since childhood, she had been ostracized by her people because of her blue eyes. Whether in Phoenicia or Crane Ladder, she never found a sense of belonging, until the day she met Ivy, who had the same eyes. Yali felt for the first time that she was no longer alone, and from that moment on, he began to have the idea of taking Ivy away. As long as you're willing to be with me, I can give up my country, give up power and wealth. No matter where it is, I can go with you. Faced with Yali's heartfelt confession, Ivy was suddenly, shyly turning her head away. Yali didn't care whether his confession would be reciprocated. He just wanted to tell Ivy what was in his heart. He so hoped this journey could continue forever, although he deliberately chose the slowest camel. But Damascus was still too close to Memphis. After 3 days of travel, they soon arrived in Memphis. Yari told Ivy to follow his plan. They were now going to pose as a brother and sister who had fled from Syria. When Ivy heard Yari call her by her real name, she once again had the illusion that he was her brother. Yari told Ivy not to daze off. Their bet was to see if Egypt had forgotten Ivy. They randomly picked a girl who was passing by. Yari, using his disguise, asked the girl for directions. His handsome face, combined with the cheesy pickup lines he casually throws out, made the girl blush and feel embarrassed in an instant. Avi, watching from the side, nearly vomited up her leftover meal. He interrupted their conversation, and asked the question he most wanted to know. That was, what happened to Nefertari now? The girl told Avi that they arrived just in time. The pharaoh will marry Nefertari as his chief queen next month. Coupled with his status as Egypt's high priest, it will surely bring prosperity to the nation. Ivy's mind went blank. He knew who Nefertari was, the girl's Nefertari, but he still couldn't believe it. He excitedly grabbed the girl's hand and questioned her about the blonde Nefertari. However, the girl seemed very resistant. He kept repeating that he didn't know her, and had never heard of such a person. After saying that, the girl quickly left, almost running away. Refusing to give up, Ivy chased the girl to a corner. After repeated pleas from him, the girl finally told Ivy what had happened. It turned out that years ago, Pharaoh's decree aimed to erase the existence of blonde girls nationwide. All documents and sculptures of her were destroyed. Anyone who dares to mention her would have their tongue cut out, because at that wedding 5 years ago, the pharaoh's colleague, the blonde girl, mysteriously disappeared after the pharaoh was injured. The strange thing is, no one saw what happened at the time. But all the ministers unanimously believed that it was the blonde girl who harmed the pharaoh, although a similar incident had occurred 10 years earlier. But what's different this time is, he harmed the pharaoh in front of a monarch. Now Egypt has already forgotten that would-be queen. Upon hearing this, Avi almost fainted. Did he come all the way back to ancient Egypt with so much difficulty, just to confirm that all the vows Fifitu made to her had long since disappeared like bubbles? Would the supreme pharaoh of Egypt really wait 10 years for a modern girl to find an answer? Ivy painstakingly returns to ancient Egypt once again. But the vows they once made have been ruthlessly swept away by time. Bifatu will marry the real Nefertari as his first queen. And there is no longer a place for her here. I don't know how much time has passed. Ivy, dazed, sits in front of Yali. When he comes to his senses, only then did he realize that he was surrounded by Hades soldiers. At the same time, with his back to the setting sun, he was moving away from Memphis. Yari told Ivy that he had already lost, and now the war was about to begin. Even if Ivy didn't want to, he would take Ivy back to Hades, because he didn't want to see Ivy harmed in any way. This reminded Ivy of her brother. Her brother had promised her that no matter when or where, he would always be by her side to protect her. In this ancient world, only now, only this person, who looks exactly like her brother, still cares about her. Only this person, who shares her eyes, understands her pain. For a moment, Ivy considered staying. But when the golden bracelet suddenly began to glow and heat up, the scorching memory, like the sun, flooded his mind again. Ivy's eyes immediately hardened. Regardless of whether Bifatu still held any affection for him, he had to see for himself. Ivy snatched Yali's small knife and held it to his own throat. He was even willing to cut open a wound. He begged Yali to let him return to Memphis. Otherwise, he would rather die here. Yali, with a sorrowful expression, begged Ivy not to hurt herself. He urged Ivy to put the knife down first. Otherwise, their horses wouldn't be able to turn around. In that moment of hesitation from Ivy, Yali suddenly pulled Ivy into a tight embrace. The knife also cut into his body because of this. Seeing this, Ivy immediately let go of the knife in her hand. Yali held her even tighter. She hadn't expected that Ivy would hurt herself for that person. Compared to the pain in her heart, the wounds on his body were nothing. Yali agreed to Ivy's request to take her back to Memphis. But at this moment, all he wanted was to just hold Ivy and stay like this for a while. Later, Yali kept rushing towards Memphis with Ivy without a moment's rest. They were almost at their destination. At the end, Yali reminded Ivy that if he lost this bet, he would have to obediently return with him. Otherwise, no matter where he hides, Yali would stop at nothing to find him and take him away. Ivy had never actually thought about what to do if he lost the bet. He had originally just wanted to use the bet to get back to Bifatu's side. At first, he was certain that as long as they met again, the mention of Bifatu would inevitably remind them of their past agreement. But along the way, the despair in their hearts grew heavier and heavier. If they got close to this man, they could lose their lives. Would you still be willing to travel through time and space to ancient Egypt? That day, the entire Memphis was unusually lively. Because today, the wedding ceremony of Bifatu and Nefertari will be held here. Ivy and Bifatu once made a promise here, to be each other's only one. He wants to see with his own eyes if Bifatu truly betrayed their promise. Seeing the real Nefertari stunned Ivy. The other woman was still so beautiful, and she was even more elegant and noble than 5 years ago. She is the rightful queen of Ramses II. Compared to him, Ivy felt she wasn't even qualified to stand by his side. He thought maybe he really should accept reality. At that moment, the crowd erupted into even louder cheers. It was Egypt's greatest pharaoh who had arrived. Bifatu rode in on a majestic horse, wearing the iconic peacock green attire. He was still the same son of the sun god, the blazing sun over the desert, from 5 years ago. Ivy finally saw again the figure that had appeared countless times in her memory. Everything seemed unchanged. He couldn't help wanting to call out Bifatu's name. However, his longing didn't reach Bifatu. Yali covered Ivy's mouth. Quiet him down. Because too many people in Egypt want him dead now, even though Bifatu was right there. But Ivy felt the greatest distance between him and him. He really wanted to ask Bifatu one question in person. Even if he was hated by everyone, or abandoned by the gods, he would willingly bear all the punishment. Ivy turned his head. He apologized to Yali with guilt. Then he shouted, "What's chasing me?" and rushed out of the crowd recklessly. He believes Yali will protect him like his brother does. He thinks, if the person he loves is Yali, how happy that would be. This time, perhaps neither he nor Yali won. Because for the man in front of her, Ivy is even willing to give up her life. The guard reported to Bifatu that Ivy was being hunted by Hetiran. Bifatu ordered to quickly control the agitated crowd. Take the troublemaker back to the palace and wait for interrogation. After saying that, he left the scene first. Later, Ivy was brought into the palace. Old Chen Shimon was conducting the interrogation of Ivy. But Ivy said this matter was crucial. He must report it directly to the pharaoh. Shimon sneered. He said if Ivy didn't speak now, no more needs to be said. Then he ordered the guards to imprison Ivy and await her execution. Just then, Biftu arrived. He asked Shemin, "Who gave you the audacity to dare to interrogate a prisoner without authorization?" He believed Ivy's information might be important. Biftu walked straight towards his throne. At the same time, he signaled Ivy to lift her head and speak. His voice was so quiet that Ivy only had to make the slightest sound for him to hear it. He couldn't imagine What would happen if Bifatu recognized him now? Would he be killed? Or is it something else? Seeing that Ivy was still reluctant to speak, Bifatu had already lost his patience. He ordered the guards to take her away. Ivy thought, if I miss this opportunity, there might never be another chance. The person in front of her, Ivy had so much she wanted to tell him. The girl once again saw the son of the sun god who appeared countless times in her memories. This might be their last chance to see each other. So Ivy shouted Biftu's name. When Biftu heard that voice which had once haunted his dreams, he instantly lost his usual composure. With mixed emotions, he lifted the scarf from Ivy's head. As her golden hair cascaded down, everyone was shocked, because the blonde girl had already become a sign of death in Egypt. Anyone who dares to mention her would have their tongue cut out. Anyone who dares to imitate her would be executed without mercy. This was a direct decree from the pharaoh. 5 years had passed. Bifetu finally sees Ivy again. He mocked himself, wondering why he couldn't find Ivy all these years. It turned out she was hidden with Yale. Seeing Bifetu misunderstanding her relationship with Yale, Ivy immediately wanted to explain. He returned from his escape this time, to tell Bifetu that the enemy's armies have reached the borders of Egypt and Syria. But Bifetu showed no emotion at all. Instead, he was scornful. Who does Iwe think he is? He just returned from Crane Ladder, and the first thing he wants to do is to inquire about Egypt's affairs? He angrily grabbed Iwe's hair, asking him, 5 years have passed. Why choose this time and this place to return? Could this possibly have nothing to do with Yale? At this time, old Shun Shimon was also fanning the flames from behind, saying to be wary of this woman, that she might be a spy sent by Yale. Ivy didn't expect to be misunderstood like this. She only hoped for Bifetu's safety before returning here. However, what met her was still Bifetu's cold words. Not just anyone is qualified to wish me well. In my eyes, you're worthless, like sand in the desert. Everything confirms Yamala's ancient curse. At this moment, it felt as if, in Ivy's heart, something shattered. All along, it was that faint hope in his heart that supported him, driving him to desperately cross time and space to return to Bifetu's side. And now, the last bit. All hope has disappeared. Ivy held back the pain in her heart. She encouraged herself not to cry. For someone who no longer cares about her, tears would only cause the other person more trouble. In the end, Ivy simply reminded Bifetu that during the time he would marry the queen, her tin would definitely launch an attack on Egypt. 5 years ago, he let Yale go. It created an irreversible situation. Now, tell Iji about the Hittites' movements. Consider it compensation. After saying this, Ivy turned around. She walked towards the door, her steps faltering. But just then, Bifetu suddenly scooped Ivy up. He angrily asked Ivy how long she planned to disappear this time. 5 years? 10 years? Or forever? Ivy told Bifetu that this time, she never intended to leave again. She had found the bracelet hidden in the rose wall in the world 3,000 years in the future. Although history had returned to the way it was, she still wanted to come back here. Because Bifetu, I love you. I only want to see you. But hurried words of love cannot make up for the pain Bifetu has suffered over the years. He hates Ivy, who, while saying she loves him, has repeatedly torn apart her vows so easily. Over the years, no matter how earnestly he prayed to the heavens, he could never find Ivy. In the end, it was a crane-step person who brought him back. Bifetu kicked the door of the palace open with one kick. He wants Ivy to prove that she loves him. He was the great pharaoh of Egypt, a being respected by thousands of people under the sun. But there was one thing that always frightened him. That's losing the girl in front of you. Ivy easily breaks and forgets their vows again and again. Bifetu wants Ivy to feel her pain. He thought that this way, Ivy would never forget him. After that night of excruciating pain, Ivy, in a daze, heard a familiar voice. The source was surprisingly the stunningly beautiful Lidahi. Ivy couldn't help but wonder, had she died? Then even Mat, the Nigeru princess, appeared there. It turned out Lidahi hadn't died. Years ago, he had dedicated himself to researching and experimenting with various poisons. His body thus developed some resistance. At that time, everyone thought he was already dead. When he was sent to the house of death to be turned into a mummy, he regained his breath and came back to life at the last moment. However, the poisoning still left him with lasting effects. For the rest of his life, he could only move around in a wheelchair. But he didn't feel sad about it. Because he gained something far more important. They are no longer Egypt's first prophet and Pharaoh's test subjects. Just an ordinary, happy couple. Your Majesty's kindness brought them together. Mat and Nefertari sincerely thank you for everything. Nothing reassures Ivy more than this scene. Once, she felt immense guilt for the harm her presence caused them. But Ivy couldn't understand why Bifetu was so kind to his subordinates, yet disregarded his own wishes. He tortured himself as if he had gone mad. Bifetu hoped Ivy would believe that Bifetu never truly wanted to hurt him. Bifetu had told Lidahi about Ivy coming from the future. He crazily built temples, sculptures, or left documents, just so that, in 3,000 years, Ivy would remember there was someone waiting for him here. But the days passed, one after another, but the miracle never happened. He feared Ivy would never appear again. He feared he wouldn't live to see that day. This was the only fear of the great Egyptian pharaoh. Thinking of Befit's lonely waiting figure, Ivy couldn't help but burst into tears, but he still didn't understand why Befit wanted to erase his existence. He is also marrying another Nefertari. Litak told him that in fact, all of this is just a scheme. The purpose of this is to deliberately confuse the neighboring countries of Egypt, to make Hutti believe there is an opportunity, and use this chance to strike a heavy blow to the enemy. Perhaps the only thing that Bifitu worries about is, if Ivy were to return now and see all this, would he still return to her side? In fact, Befit never forgot their vows. Ivy is the queen of Egypt, his one and only great wife. Befit never forgot their vows. Ivy is the queen of Egypt, his only wife. Marrying Nefertari was just a ploy to lure the enemy. Ivy misunderstood Bifitu. 5 years apart. The truly cruel one is himself. Ivy wants to see Bifitu now. But Bifitu has already led 3 armies to Syria to fight the Hittite army. Ivy immediately realized, this was the world-famous Battle of Kadesh. According to historical records, it was a very perilous battle. Ramesses II fell into an ambush by the Hittite army due to false enemy intelligence. Fortunately, another of his armies arrived in time to help him escape the predicament. Ivy remembers that the army was called the Pata Legion. She immediately asked Lita about the current situation of that legion. He also said that the army must set out immediately to support the front lines. Otherwise, Bifitu will be in mortal danger. Rite could tell that Ivy truly loved His Majesty. They clearly loved each other. But they were cruelly played by fate, constantly hurting each other, like 2 hedgehogs yearning for warmth. The closer we get, the more we hurt each other. Rita told Ivy, the Putha Legion is known for its defense among the 4 major legions. It serves as the last line of defense for the kingdom. Currently, they are stationed here at Memphis West, and the commander of this army is none other than Rita. Although he would love to lead the legion into battle alongside the pharaoh, unfortunately, he is probably powerless to do so now. Ivy once again feels guilty about Ritea's situation. It was because of him that Rite couldn't stand by Bifitu's side. But this legion is really too important. Without their strength, Bifitu might have really died this time. Could it be that my presence has once again changed history? While Ivy was still mired in guilt, Dita gave Ivy a path to follow. Although she can no longer lead the army into battle, Ivy can stand by the pharaoh's side in her place. Matnafir also came before Ivy, requesting her to lead this legion to protect the pharaoh. Jehudi told Ivy not to worry about staying here. If the pharaoh is truly defeated, they won't survive here anyway. Their happiness is a gift from the pharaoh. Their loyalty will always belong to him. If he tragically leaves this world, they will follow him to another world to continue serving him. Dite handed the token and the task of guarding the pharaoh to Ivy. Matt and Nijiru also gave Ivy the clothes for the expedition. Ivy sincerely offered his apologies and gratitude to Dite and the others. He thought that since it was his destined fate to be by that person's side, he should no longer feel confused about changing history. Ivy prepares to march forward. This time, he will fight to protect Bifitu. He raises the token in his hand. He orders the Puthak Legion to immediately march towards Kadesh. This is the most famous battle of Kadesh in Egyptian history. Led by Ramses II himself, the army heads north to fight for control of Syria. At first, the 3 great legions under the pharaoh advanced rapidly, until they crossed the Orontes River. They were ambushed by the Heti army. The legion in front, the Lien Legion, had already collapsed. Bifitu was leading the Amon Legion, struggling to hold on. Meanwhile, the final Set Legion had inexplicably remained in the rear. The commander of the Set Legion informed him that there were no Heti forces ahead. The guards were all Buka. A terrifying thought suddenly flashed through Bifitu's mind. And what was worse, at this time, a black flag with the character, "Surrender," was raised ahead. It was Yali, leading his main force, arriving here. He waved his hand. The soldiers charged forward one after another. Bifitu fought very bravely. He knocked down the incoming enemies one by one, even though he suffered several deep wounds. He never stopped wielding his long sword, because Bifit wanted to live. Returning to Ivy's side was the belief that sustained him. Yali couldn't help but admire his perseverance. But this was ultimately just a desperate struggle, because he still had 8,000 soldiers left on the other side of the river. These were meant to counter the pharaoh's highly combative Set army. However, he hadn't anticipated that those troops wouldn't come to support the front lines at all. That's why Ramesses ended up in such a disastrous situation. Heti's deployment of troops this time is a sure win. Years ago, old Minister Kaiman was constantly betrayed by geography. Egyptian intelligence was given to Heti, because Ramesses had no heir. As long as he died, Kaiman was confident that he could help his son-in-law, the fourth prince, seize the throne and become king. Therefore, Hedy was willing to sacrifice Yamanra to keep Kaiman, his strongest trump card. And from the start, Ari recognized the recent wedding as merely a lure for the enemy, because he firmly believed that the man's admiration for the blonde maiden would not be easily forgotten. So he turned the tables, launching an attack to harass the Egyptian border. Now, the chance to defeat that man is before him. Ari ordered Tutmos to leave the 8,000 soldiers opposite where they were. He wanted to let Ramses fall before him fairly, capture him alive. However, at this moment, a figure holding a battle flag suddenly descended onto the battlefield beneath the sunset. Shiawi, leading the Putha Legion, arrived just in time. According to historical records, during the Battle of Kadesh, Ramesses II found himself in a desperate battle. Just as he was about to be defeated, the Putha Legion arrived. They brought Ramses II a new lease on life. Egypt regrouped. Utilizing their expertise in phalanx formations, they repelled the Hittite chariot army. Avi raced to be by Befetu's side. Befetu opened his arms to embrace Avi. But he received a slap instead. Before Befetu could ask his questions, Ivy tightly embraced Befetu again. She cried out, cursing Befetu for abandoning her. She wanted Befetu to live a long life, to live to a ripe old age, and to stay by her side. For a lifetime, never to part. Befetu stood frozen, speechless. In her eyes, countless complex emotions flashed in an instant. When every reunion means another separation, will you still believe in a promise of never parting? To save Befetu's life. To stay with him for life. Avi came here with Egypt's last strength. His promise was so beautiful that Befetu couldn't believe it. But no matter how many times, he would still choose to believe in Avi. On this battlefield bathed in the setting sun, they promised to be together for life, never to be separated. Compared to their beautiful promise, Yari appeared very lonely. But he knew that no matter how much he loved Ivy, her heart could not hold anyone else. He thought, if there were a next life, how he wished Ivy could feel the pain of loving someone who cannot love you back, even if it's just for a brief moment. He hoped that Ivy could fall in love with him. Yari silently raised his right hand, and simultaneously ordered the soldiers engaged with the Egyptian legion to retreat. Everyone drew their bows and shot at the Egyptians, facing imminent death. Ivy's eyes were filled with determination. As long as she could be with Befetu, he isn't afraid to die here. They won't have misunderstandings anymore, nor will they suffer anymore. Befetu gently touched Ivy's head. As long as I'm here, you won't die. Then Befetu raised his right hand. In his hand was a token shimmering with golden light. Then a long sword was immediately pressed against Yali's neck. It turned out that Tut was a spy sent by Egypt. Yali never expected that he would have a fatal flaw. He recalled when Tut first appeared before him. It was exactly 5 years ago, around the time he returned from Egypt. And recently, Ivy rode his camel back to Egypt. And just now, he rushed here, neglecting the 8,000 soldiers on the opposite bank. None of this was accidental, because everything was for the true master he swore allegiance to. Yali asked Tudor with great interest, what should we do next? Should we kill ourselves with our own hands? Ford, full of guilt, apologized to Yali. In this life, he was Egyptian. He could only swear allegiance to the pharaoh. If there is a next life, he was willing to follow Yale loyally. With their supreme ruler under control, the entire Hittite army immediately collapsed. They surrendered en masse. Ivy and Befit looked deeply into each other's eyes. After all their hardships, finally, this time they could be together. However, something unexpected happened. A Hittite raised his bow and arrow. He angrily shouted, the Egyptian pharaoh must die, and fired the arrow. Ivy instinctively shielded Befit from the arrow. It looked like the arrow was about to pierce Ivy. In a flash, Befit pulled Ivy in front of him. He took the sharp arrow in his unprotected back. Fragmented memories suddenly flooded into Ivy's mind. It was as if she had seen the same terrifying scene in a distant dream. She had once witnessed the same horrific event. At the moment when Befetu blocked the cold arrow for Ivy, fragmented memories suddenly flooded into his mind. It was as if he had been living the same repetitive dream for a long time. In the dream, that person showered him with infinite love. They held a grand and magnificent wedding. Yet all the happy days eventually lead to that tragic end. Every time, he hoped he wouldn't have this dream. The end came with a thud. Befetu fell before Ivy. The others, reacting a beat too late, immediately hacked the assailant to death. It turned out that the man was the brother of the reckless brute who had followed Yali to assassinate Behetu 2 years ago. Toot never expected that such a person had infiltrated his carefully selected team. Blood began to pour from Befetu's mouth. The arrow might have pierced his lung. Ivy immediately called for the army doctor. However, Befetu grabbed Ivy's hand to stop him from doing so. Because the arrowhead is poisoned. Right now, he just wanted Ivy to remember what he was about to say. Ivy told Befetu not to speak. He didn't want to remember. Whatever it was, he could tell him later. But Befit knew his time was running out. He told Ivy to immediately lead Ta's legion back to Egypt. Use your teeth to ensure safety if necessary. He reminded Ivy to watch out for Buka. That man still leads Seth's legion. By now, Befit's hands were growing colder. But he was still giving his final instructions. After he dies, the throne will be inherited by the 8th king emperor. Hymen is a traitor in Egypt. Montes will take care of everything. Ivy just needs to return to Egypt safely. Ivy cried out, begging Bifitu to stop talking. He was the third pharaoh of Egypt's 19th dynasty. He lived for 96 years. A brand new city named Byramesis was also established. Ivy told Bifitu that this was her history. She would not die here. Bifitu gently wiped the tears from Ivy's cheek. She looked so happy. Meeting and getting to know Ivy was the happiest thing in her life. She was grateful to have protected Ivy in her final moments. Unfortunately, she could no longer see that beloved face clearly. Way, I love you. And thank you. As the words fell, Befitu's eyes closed forever. No matter how Ivy called her, she would never open them again. At that moment, it was as if the curse of Yamanra echoed once more in her ears. I curse you to be separated from her just like I am. I curse you to be worth nothing in her heart just like I am. Unless that person dies for you. Otherwise, this curse will never disappear. At this moment, the curse is finally broken. However, the life of the Egyptian pharaoh has already perished. The Nile and this golden land have also seen his sunset. At the cost of the pharaoh's life, the curse on the girl was lifted. But it was all meaningless now. With the fall of the sun child, the entire battlefield fell deathly silent. Only Ivy's heart-wrenching cries remained. His tears fell onto Bifitu's body. The next moment, his body suddenly emitted a golden light. The source of the light is that golden bracelet, covered in cracks. The moment Ivy picked up the bracelet, her entire body began to glow with an even brighter golden light. An ancient chant entered Ivy's mind. The golden bracelet created an illusory history, traversing endless time and space. The golden bracelet carried too much of the past, witnessing too much pain. The golden bracelet is the nexus that connects two timelines. The golden bracelet disappears. The illusion of history vanishes. Everything returns to zero. Everything returns to the beginning. Ivy seems to understand the meaning of the golden bracelet. She takes Ivy to ancient Egypt, creating the illusion of history. If the golden bracelet disappears, everything will return to the beginning. Bifitu will not die because of himself. He will live to a ripe old age, as recorded in history. But he will forget every little detail with Ivy, because Ivy will never appear there again. He will no longer remember their encounters and love, nor will he remember that he once risked his life to protect Ivy. It's as if he never existed at all. He won't remember anything. Ivy wished she could stay by Bifitu's side forever, to be his great wife, to bear him lovely children. But more than that, Ivy just hoped Bifitu could live on. Even if he would completely forget her, falling in love with other women, marrying hundreds of concubines. Ivy bent down and kissed the lips that still held the warmth from the photo. You were the one who was abandoned first. The vow left before me. Idiot, live on well. After saying that, Ivy forced back her sadness and put on the golden bracelet. The surrounding time and space immediately froze in place. Only that bracelet continued to emit a dazzling golden light. Scenes from the past replayed like a rewind. They reappeared before Ivy's eyes. During the first time travel, Mentis forcibly brought Ivy to Bifitu's side. During the second time travel, Rita told him that a person's appearance can change, but the only thing that can't change is her inner soul. And Bifitu, waiting again and again, promise after promise, Ivy kept all of this firmly in her heart. In the reverse flow of time, Bifitu came back to life. She immediately realized that Ivy was about to leave her again. She cried out desperately, begging Ivy not to leave her. Yet no words of love could overcome the emptiness in her hand. They couldn't hold each other's hands. They could only watch helplessly as the other disappeared before their eyes. The torrent of time made you lose yourself in the millennia of space. The broken curse brought you back to the starting point of reality. The golden bracelet disappeared. The illusory history has also disappeared. Everything returns to zero. Everything returns to the beginning. Nile, my mother. I drank this life-giving water with him. We made a promise in memory, never to forget the afterlife. This is a fragment of a dream that haunts the mind of an Egyptian pharaoh. Every day, he has the same recurring dream. In the dream, the girl has eyes the color of the sky, and hair as radiant as the sun. He says his name is Nefertari. But Befit searched all of Egypt and couldn't find such a girl. He only found a girl of the same age among the pharaoh's consorts. That year, Ramesses II ascended the throne. He became the third pharaoh of the 19th dynasty of Egypt. In his 90-plus years of life, he not only brought Egypt to unprecedented heights, but also constructed many breathtaking temples and sculptures, that even 3,000 years later, still stand vividly, standing there, in a castle somewhere in London, England. Today is Ivy's 17th birthday. His brother, Aicien, gave him a special birthday gift. It was a snake-shaped gold bracelet that shimmered with golden light. The moment Wei put on the bracelet, he seemed to realize that he had forgotten something very important. The next moment, the bracelet began to emit dazzling golden light. When the light faded, the bracelet disappeared as well. But in his mind, the long-forgotten memories came rushing back. Those amber eyes, full of kingly aura. And those oaths as hot as the sun. Ivy remembered it all at this moment. He told his brother that he was going to Egypt. Aicien had never seen Ivy with such a firm yet sorrowful gaze. He promised Ivy, no matter where she wanted to go, she would go with him. In that moment, Ivy felt an indescribable pain in her heart. He remembered that he had once said the same thing. This time, Ivy still didn't choose him. He decided to go to Egypt alone. Before leaving, he wished Aicien happiness. Because he loved her deeply. She loved him like a sister. Ivy once again stepped onto the land blessed by the sun god. It was as if just breathing the air here transported Ivy back to the time and space of 1,000 years ago. Here, her presence still lingered. Even though what she saw was a love she had sworn to another, Ivy still longed to return to her side. Accompanying her on the journey here were Aishin's subordinates. I don't know if it's coincidence or fate. He actually bears an identical resemblance to Tut, a subordinate from his past life. In this land that believes in reincarnation, Ivy couldn't help but feel a surge of hope. Soon, they arrived at the ruins of the Abu Simbel temple. Across 3,000 years, the gods of the heavens and the gods of posterity have continuously witnessed the miracles here. Bifit had once told Ivy, no matter where he goes, or what he becomes, this place is the proof of his love. But Ivy doesn't know what she is hoping for. This sculpture is not him. In that space and time, there was no trace of him by Bifitu's side. All those beautiful memories have already vanished with the golden bracelet. Ivy was surprised to find, however, that she could actually understand the words on the stele. It was filled with Ramses' prayers to the Egyptian gods. Ivy looked at the words, full of longing, in disbelief. Who was the person he wanted to see again? Was it Nefertari? And at that moment, a person appeared behind him. That person had a head of fiery red hair, familiar to Ivy. Before Ivy could react, a voice that only appeared in her dreams echoed from behind him. Ivy, remember, the pact we made, drinking from the Nile together. A promise to recall. Never forgetting the past. This was the supreme pharaoh of Egypt's pact with a modern girl, transcending time and space.